To call the meeting to order. Welcome to the School District of Waukesha, the Finance and Facilities Committee meeting for October 12th, 2020. Patrick McCaffrey is excused and he usually chairs this meeting. So will you please, Darren, will you please verify that we've been properly posted?
Yes, we have.
Okay, thank you. And we usually like to start off our meetings by listening to our citizens. Are there any citizens in the audience that would like to address us this evening? I don't see anyone signed up.
And there's no one in 109 either, so.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you. Moving on to our action items. First on the agenda is the approval of the September 14th, 2020 minutes. Do I have a motion to that degree?
I so move.
Moved by Diane Voigt. Is there a second?
I'll
Second by
second.
Corey. Any discussion? Any changes?
No, thank you.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Passes 4-0. Karen? Moving on to our vouchers. Sherry, did we have, I know we had some questions because I asked some questions.
Yes, we have a couple of
And
questions.
maybe there's more.
Yes, there were. So you all have the handout, but I'll quickly go through them. First question was on voucher 336569, CISA 1 contract. The total voucher was for $298,877.47. The question was, are there really Board of Education membership fees for CISA 1? Several of the line items had indicated dues, fees, memberships, Board of Education members. This check is for the payment of our CISA contract. We have 2 installments every year, and there's 4 components that get charged to the Board of Education budget. But because of the way the Skyward account numbers are, it shows up a little funky because it shows that it looks like membership fees, but the 4 components that are being charged to the board budget are the basic CISA 1 overall membership fee, and then there's a flat service fee just to participate in CISA 1, and then the School Improvement Services Network, a seat on that committee, and then a membership to the Institute at CISA 1. And those are the things that are being charged to the Board of Education budget. It isn't that they're for memberships for the Board of Education.
Gotcha. I appreciate that clarification. I think I've asked that question in the past too, but I have a short memory, so.
Well, it is, Skyward, because we have to call each component of the account number something. Sometimes when you string together the account number and all its components, the wording comes up a little weird, and it doesn't always necessarily reflect what has actually been spent.
Yeah, fair enough. Appreciate that.
Okay, voucher number 336889, purchase power for $2,000. That is to reload our postage machine at Lindholm here in the mailroom. Why the invoice says Board of Education, I don't know. It's being charged to the business office, not to the Board of Education. We can certainly change that. It must have been how we've been doing it for a while. We can have the wording changed for future. But then what happens is every month we go in and we do a journal entry. We look at all the actual usage and we charge that money back to each department that's been using the postage machine. So we do that with a journal entry.
I appreciate that explanation too. I just saw another,
Word.
really?
I know, it's an odd descriptor on there. I had never noticed that before, but
I appreciate that.
we can certainly change it just to be more accurate. Okay, vouchers number 336602 and 336661 for Jensen Equipment Company, totaling $52,976.40. And the question was that they noted the expense for Jensen Equipment Company. Waukesha is listed as a Pure FX user on their promotional materials. Is this a monthly expense for sanitizing chemicals, or is it high with the cost of applicator equipment? And a good chunk of that was the startup cost to purchase the backpack sprayers, the big drums to stir it in because it comes in a concentrate, and then handheld sprayers to use throughout the district. And the startup portion of that was $11,541.30. The remaining $36,000 was for 300 units of 32-gallon mix. Now, that wasn't just for September. We still have a good portion of it. I've talked to Tim, and what they're working on is what does this cost us per square foot to use this, so we can get a better idea of what it's costing at each site, but we don't have that number yet. But we can certainly circle back or have Darren put it in on a Friday update or something once we have that information. But it was our startup, but we don't know right now how long that's going to take us out.
Further question or comments on that one? All right.
Okay, and then the last was a question. It wasn't related to a specific voucher, but it was a question about AVID expenses each year and the professional development portion of it, and what are the revenue sources that we use to cover the cost of the program. We don't have a specific line item for AVID. AVID is kind of bundled into teaching and learning and across the site, so it's being paid for from different places. And it's all under different account numbers, so it wasn't easy to be able to pull out just what's the AVID budget. I am in contact with Teaching and Learning to see if they can give me an idea of what they budget every year for AVID. However, I did attach a chart of what we've spent for the last 4 years, if that's helpful. Now, and it's broken down by department with the exception of the last 3 years. There's P-card purchases, and it's really not a simple task to go in and figure out the P-cards when I'm pulling it in from a vendor view to get that account number to know what, if was that by a site or a department that used their P-card to pay for it. So the last 3 years have like a vague P-card section as far as an expense. But the grand total over the last 4 years has been $558,868.60. That's purely payments to AVID. It doesn't include any travel costs that are associated with going to the AVID conferences and things like that people attend. And like I said, I'm working with T&L to see if we can get a better picture of the budget. As far as where the money comes from, it's pretty much our local dollars are being used to support this. There's a little bit that Carl is out of Carl Perkins that's listed in the breakout. Carl Perkins is one of our grants, but very minimal amount of money comes out of there. Otherwise, it's just coming out of our Fund 10 local dollars. Any further questions on that?
Yes, Corey.
Oh, our purchasing card, this is credit card, the district credit cards. Each site has each principal has a credit card, and each department head in this building has a credit card, sorry.
And with the P card, we get discounts and some other things.
We get a rebate.
A rebate.
We get,
rebate.
Now we get monthly rebates from U.S. Bank.
And that's one of the reasons why we chose to go to the P card. There were several other reasons. And we do get all the lists of expenses on the P card too for our review, that we can ask questions on it any time at the FNF.
Yep, absolutely. I provide a little more detail as one of the reports. Voucher reports includes more P-card detail. But at the view that I was looking at AVID to be able to pull in all the expenditures, it's not an easy connect unless you go into each and every transaction to pull out what account number was used for it, and it would have been a very timely thing. It certainly can be done. If the detail is needed, I certainly can do it. It's just I wanted to make sure it was necessary before spending the time on it. So.
Biggest difference between a credit card and the P card, they function the same, they look the same, but we have more management control under our district program. Otherwise, you wouldn't know. Jim has one. I don't ever use mine, but you wouldn't know it from any other thing. But we can management and turn cards off and adjust credit limits more.
Credit limits, we can adjust what they can use it for. Like they can't use it at a liquor store, you can't use it at a veterinarian, you can't use it at anything that would be obviously not school related is cut off in there. So it helps to limit the exposure of what's being done.
Yes, Corey.
Sorry. For 2018, 2019, why is that number different than the other, or significantly different than the other years? I don't know if that's something you can address now, but.
I would have to look into that. It's pretty similar to 17, 18. I know AVID has grown, so every year it's grown a little bit, and those last 2 years were substantially in that growth phase and expanding it more across to other schools.
I'm sorry, I meant the P card.
Oh, the P card, I'm sorry. Why was it?
Well, the P card didn't exist in 16, 17.
Correct. But in 1819, I believe it appears to me that teaching and learning put their we're encouraging people to use their P cards because we get a rebate. But it looked to me like one of the big purchases in 1819 was a teaching and learning expenditure, because if you look under teaching and learning, you'll see that in other years when the P card was not so high, they had a higher expenditure. So I believe they just used their P card to make one of their their annual fees that year.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions on the vouchers that,
Nope, that was all I had.
any other live questions on the vouchers? Sometimes those live ones can be tough to answer, but we could get it the following month.
We're always willing to take a stab or find the information for a future update.
Yes. Okay, I'd be looking for a motion to approve the vouchers.
So moved?
Okay, is there a second to that? Second by Karen. Further discussion? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Passes 4-0, Darren. And those are the 2 action items that we have tonight. We do have 5 discussion and information items, though. And we're going to start with the HVAC system. We had asked to get some more information on the plasma ionization process. So, Darren, I'll turn that over to you, and I think we have some guests to also help us on this topic.
Want to come up to the table there. As I'd been emailing you, and I believe we discussed at our meeting last month, we had wanted to find out a little more about whether this was the best solution for us, the best investment, all the other needs we have in our maintenance department. And we talked about coming up with a cost-effective way to research it. So Ring and Do is our commissioning agent for all of our construction sites. And Kurt Wiebelhaus, who's our owner's rep, reached out to them to see if they would do a study of some of our buildings to see if, what's the best solution. And keep in mind and Joe's here from our maintenance department, he was here back 3 months ago or so, 2 months ago, to kind of review all of our systems. So keep in mind, not all of our systems are identical. They all have different shapes and sizes, but we came up with this, and we've taken a look at Rose Glen as a sample school. Rose Glen, Bethesda, and Meadowbrook are all kind of sister schools, same floor plan. Rose Glen's a little bigger than Meadowbrook, but overall it's the same building. So we moved away from Les Paul, which was our first thought because of work that's still going on there and will go on there. We didn't think it was a representative of the schools that we have out in the field. So again, we bring back this report, and this is not anything to do with me. I don't have a horse in this race. We wanted independent, as we talked about, we wanted independent engineers to come in and give us their opinion with no other goal in mind. So I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman here, and they'll walk you through. You have a hard copy of the PowerPoint, but it'll also be on the screen for you to look at as well. So, gentlemen, I don't know who wants to lead off or.
I'll just say a couple comments in preparation for Ring and Do to start. Really, over the last number of meetings that the return to school plan was talked about, HVAC was a big piece of that, or was a piece of that. Ionization was a discussion as a not so much a newer technology, but a newer application for the technology. And really, when we engaged Ring and Do, the question that I had asked them, Tim had put some budgets together of, okay, if we put ionization in each of the buildings across the district, it was about $1.5 million to $2 million price tag. And really the question I asked Ring and Do is, if the district is going to spend $2 million on a solution, what is the best solution to spend money on? Is it ionization, or is it something else to improve indoor air quality? So that was kind of the directive that I gave them. We used Rose Glen as as kind of a representative school, working with Joe, as far as that school has more similar systems than any other school, but there's a lot of variation throughout the district. So that was the kind of the charge we gave them to do that, and also they had listened back to a couple of the meetings where there's some questions about ionization. So I asked them to provide a little more education as well with the background and knowledge, just to help to have an informed decision. So this is Kirk and Scott from Ring and Do.
All right, Scott, Kirk, nice to meet everybody.
Welcome.
Thank you.
If your mic's not on, just turn your mic is on. There you go.
Come on, we'll go through it again so people can hear us.
Okay, I'm Scott Agnostick from Ring and Do.
And Kirk Stuckey from Ring and Do Chateau as well.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So as Kurt was saying, the question was posed to us, if the $1 million, $2.5 million to $2 million is a budget number, is there best spent on bipolar ionization, or is there a better use for those dollars, right? So as we built this presentation, Kirk is the brains behind the operation. I work more on the commissioning side of the world, so I'm working on the referendum projects right now at Les Paul, Horning, Butler, and South. And so with that, I guess we'll turn over to start our presentation.
Perfect. Just as a little background, so for those of you who don't know who we are, I've got a couple of brief slides that we'll just kind of breeze through on that. We've been around since 1961, so we've been around a while, dealing with regional, local, and national clients. We've got just about 100 people now, 3/4 of which are in engineering staff. So we are an HVAC, plumbing, electrical, commissioning, design services type of firm. If you want to go to the next slide. So a lot of times in most of our projects, it requires close coordination between the various trades. So that's kind of our bailiwick. You can go to the next slide. A couple of things that really set us apart from everybody else. When people typically come to work with us, they stay here for a long time. So our average length of stay for employees are about 12 years, and that's currently. We've got a depth of knowledge in various disciplines and basically subject matter experts, so to speak. So go to the next slide, please. So COVID-19. The big thing with this is that there is no silver bullet for it, unfortunately. Everybody wants one, but nobody's created one as of yet. We can deal with it from an HVAC perspective, but HVAC isn't going to solve all the problems or all the concerns with it. So I want to make sure everybody's fully aware of that. And beyond HVAC, I've listed a couple of the other building operation type of impacts for that. So that kind of sets that, or helps explain that a little bit better. One thing I do want to make mention of as well, if as we're going through this, you guys have questions, feel free to stop us and just ask along the way. The intention is for this, using this as a guide, not as
Right.
the end-all be-all, so to speak.
Right.
The next couple of slides, we included just more for informational purposes. This really talks about what you guys have done to date. A lot of text, a lot of small text, not really intending to go through anything specifically other than from a big picture standpoint, you guys have followed the ASHRAE Recommendations, and for those of you who aren't aware, ASHRAE is basically the professional society that gives us all of the national, international guidelines as to where these designs should go. So you guys are following those. We can
Yeah,
skip by.
those ASHRAE standards were presented in July and maybe August too. I can't remember exactly, but we talked at length about them when Joe and Tim came and presented. So.
And the nice thing about ASHRAE specifically too is they do continually update the information. I was looking on it just today, and some of the stuff that's later in the slide deck, I've got a link that'll, if anybody's really interested and wants to understand more about something specifically, there are a lot of other technologies that are discussed at the end there as well. So we can actually skip ahead until we get to the HVAC impacts. Perfect. So as we start talking about COVID-19 and its impacts on your facilities, really it comes down to kind of in order of importance, making sure we've got the right outside air ventilation rates in the spaces, making sure that we are recirculating as high an air change rate as we can in those spaces, providing an adequate level of filtration, making sure our systems are clean, and then and that applies to basically all the various types of systems that you've got throughout the district. Ventilation effectiveness. So in the perfect world, you'd want to set the systems up so you're kind of supplying the air low in the room and exhausting or removing it high in the room so that air that I interact with, Scott next to me doesn't interact with or anything like that. Now, that's the perfect world, and brand new buildings, that's what you may want to do, but obviously we've got constraints with existing buildings that way. Next slide. For filtration, really that has a lot of additional implications. So big picture wise, we want to do the best job that we can with air filtration. So right now we've got MERV 8 filters installed generally throughout, right, Joe?
Throughout, the new construction has 13s in the new equipment that's been up and running now since middle or end of August, so.
Perfect. Now, as we look to increase beyond MERV 8 filtration, that starts having an impact on the capacity of the systems to deliver enough heating or cooling to the various spaces that they serve. It can have the replacement cost for the individual filters themselves. As we go up in filter efficiency, the costs increase as well. In addition to that, you've also paid an energy or an electrical cost impact as you start putting better filtration in. You've got a larger pressure drop, so more energy is required to push through those filters and deliver air to the spaces. It has a facility impact because now we got to maintain those filters. We've got to keep an eye on them, because if we're not actually doing that, we can start having a drastic fall off in the amount of air that we're actually able to deliver to the various spaces. And as we try to ramp systems up so that they can deliver a higher air change rate, what we also run into is that we can have negative acoustical implications.
I'm sorry. What do you mean by the last thing?
Gets loud.
It gets loud.
Yeah,
Yeah.
potentially things get loud because you're moving air faster, so air be coming through the diffusers, you hear air noise, potentially.
I think I remember from your last presentation, do the MERV 13s have to be replaced more often than the MERV 8s?
No. Well, we'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
There's this line
It's
of
more
filtering, yeah.
nuanced than that. Thank you. So we talked about outside air ventilation. So as we talk about what we'd actually want to do with that, like Kurt had mentioned earlier, with that $1.5 to $2 million, if that were our budget, so to speak, this is the order in which we'd want to actually start implementing things. We want to make sure we have our outside air rates correct, that we provide the right amount of air change rates in the space. And there was a question earlier in one of the school board meetings that I had seen that talked about air change rates. So a lot of that, any air that you deliver to the room is considered part of the air change rate. So whether it comes from the outside or whether it just comes from the space itself, that's all part of the total air change rate for the space. So if we've got 25% of the air is coming from outside and the other 75% is coming from the room that we're sitting in, that still makes up the entire amount of air change rates in the space. So if we had 8 air changes in this room to begin with, and 25% of that was coming from the outside, we'd have 2 air change rates of outside air, and then 8 air changes total.
So, yeah, it's really the air coming in and then coming into the room, leaving the room, going through a filter and coming back. It's the filtration scrubbing of it. That's the change.
Does that make sense?
Admittedly, no.
Fair?
You're filtering all the air, whether it's
Correct.
inside or
Yes.
outside.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's the definition of air change.
So it all counts in the total quantity that's being delivered to the room. That help clear things up a little bit better?
Does it matter then what percentage comes from outside and what's?
It does, because the entire intention with bringing air from the outside is you're trying to dilute the concentration of COVID and whatever else, and odors specifically is usually what people are trying to dilute. So you're diluting that by bringing more outside air in. Now, you can only bring so much in with the equipment that you've got in place to begin with without running out of capacity. If you look at your furnace at home, if you were to double the amount of fresh air that you bring in from the outside to it, the furnace is likely going to have a problem maintaining temperature within the various rooms in your house.
Yeah, a cold house, yeah.
Does that help?
It does, thank you.
Good.
Perfect. So we talked about air change rates, air filtration. We'd want to do better on that. We'd want to make sure our systems were clean. And then after we've got those first 4 things done, then we'd start taking a look at other technologies. That kind of basically builds the foundation at which you start applying those other technologies.
Yeah, Karen?
So if the temperature would be changed at home, if it couldn't keep up with that, what about our big buildings? Just that I don't see a temperature change on these.
So the buildings here are designed they're designed for a range of amount of outside air and the varying conditions outside. So as the temperatures get colder outside, it's harder for the equipment to deliver the same amount of outside air. So as what you may end up seeing in a building, in a really old building, you may end up seeing that the outside air flows, the amount of outside air that you actually get to the rooms starts decreasing as your temperatures get colder outside. So inside, you won't see any difference in temperature because everybody wants to make sure we don't freeze our buildings, but you'll end up making up for that by decreasing the amount of air that you bring in from the outside. Does that make sense?
So and then the opposite is true. During the warmer times of the year, you can get
Yes.
greater amounts of outside air.
Like right now, when it's in the low 50s, you'd get close to being able to bring in 100% outside air if you wanted.
Right.
What is that roughly like at 0 degrees? Roughly. I know
That's a
we
tough one to
can't
answer.
say
You really need to
specific
know
to
more
a
about-
building, but
Yeah.
Kind of depends on the space.
It does.
Yeah.
If you're just talking about the typical classroom, it's probably 0, it's probably somewhere between 25 and 40%. Does that think that through a little bit?
just to, because we have no
No,
understanding, we
absolutely.
have no
Yep.
perspective on that, so just to have an idea.
Yep.
And so now we've talked on the capacity, and like we had mentioned too, as the temperatures get warmer outside, it does give us the ability to dilute whatever is in the space more with more outside air. This does have the potential, so if we delivered 100% outside air to all the spaces 100% of the time, that would have a drastic impact on the energy cost to heat and cool your buildings. And it would also, you'd see a big variance in what kind of temperatures you'd be able to maintain in each of the spaces too. So generally speaking, people don't go for 100% outside air unless you've got some design reason, like you've got a kitchen or something like that, that you're trying to make sure that you're only delivering the air that you're actually exhausting out of that building or out of that space.
Right. It's the old adage that my dad always used to say, we're not heating up the outside by keeping the door open, right? Because you're bringing in all 100% outdoor air, you're heating 100% of the outside air. So that whole recirculation air change is the key to, you got to balance energy with that as well.
Yes. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
One other thing that I want to make mention, and then we can move on from this slide as well, is that typically when our buildings go unoccupied, when everybody's left the building for the day, we can close the outside air. Now with COVID-19, you don't necessarily want to close it completely, because part of it is you want to make sure that you can dilute any contaminants or any of the virus that you've got in the spaces already, So you're likely to leave the outside air dampers open at least for a few hours before and after the buildings are occupied. Yes?
Are the dampers I'm sorry. Are the dampers adjusted manually or per school, or is it automatic?
No, and this I'm going to look to,
All of our dampers are all controlled with a building automation system. And basically a control program that would automate their function throughout the course of the day, whether it be, such as what Kirk and Scott were discussing, based on outside temperature, it'll modulate open and close. Whether it be the desired range, 50 to 55, 60, 65 degrees. We cheat it up because we like to introduce in as much outside air as we possibly can. So. You're welcome.
was there another question too?
No, I saw Corey's hand go up, so I called on him, that's all.
Perfect. We can move on to the
But you
next
got to him before I did, so, you know. The difference in age is what I'm going to chuck.
Sorry. So, one of our other goals is to deliver as much air to each of the individual rooms as we can. Part of the reason for that is all the air that's being delivered to the room, it's got to pass through filters back at the source equipment, whatever is providing the heating and cooling to the space. So anytime we go through that filter, we are more likely able to pull the virus and other contaminants, dust, dirt, out of the airstream and actually catch it with that filter, which is what the entire goal of that filter is. Now, as we start looking to increase the amount of air we deliver to every space, that can start we may start running into some limitations on that equipment as well, where we won't be able to get any more air out of those systems. If we use the furnace analogy again, those furnace fans, they've got their motors on them, and if you want to get more air out of it, you only have so much that you can do with the equipment that's in place. So you can speed the fan up to a certain extent, but then you're going to start running out of motor horsepower. And then at that point, then you start running into asking yourself the question, does it make more sense to try to squeak anything more out of this fan or replace it with a different fan? And no different than the outside air, because we're running our fans harder to get increased airflow in the spaces, we do have an energy penalty or an electrical cost to run those motors at a higher speed, so to speak, to deliver that air to the spaces. And lastly, with the off-hours operations, the biggest impact there is for these rooms now, with COVID-19, we really want to keep the systems running continuously. No different than my example on the outside air, where you would typically shut it off when the buildings aren't up or when nobody's in the buildings. Now we'd want to make sure that that at least the fans run continuously so that they can continue to bring contaminants out of the rooms and get them back to the filters, excuse me, and have a higher likelihood of pulling it out of the airstream. Make sense? Next slide, please. Air filtration. Here, there are 1,000 different ways to skin this cat, so to speak, or 1,000 different filter types. Right now, in place, the majority of the facilities have MERV 8 filters. We'd be looking to do something better than that, and one of the slides that we'll get to, actually,
The next slide.
why don't we skip ahead one slide?
Yeah, the next slide, yeah, this kind of shows it.
This shows the various filter types that are out there and what they kind of look like. I figured a picture is worth
Right.
1,000 words there. And if you've seen the various filters, the ones that you would typically see at home would look something more like the MERV 8 or MERV 10 filter in the top
Possibly.
row. Yeah. Or they might be just a polyester plasticized type of mesh system that's on the MERV 1 to 7 filters.
Which is kind of what we observed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when we
So-
were at Rose Glen, that's similar to what was there.
Yep.
You can get, some manufacturers do have higher filtration rates out of those roll type media. And that's how you were able to get to the MERV 8 rating on the filters that you got at Rose Glen.
Yep.
If we move on to the next slide. So realistically, I heard the question, how big is COVID-19? Will filters actually stop it, catch it? COVID-19, current research says it's somewhere about 0.1 microns, so very, very small, between 0.1 and 0.2, somewhere in that range. And a lot of information in this table. The biggest takeaways on this is as you move up in filter efficiency and as your MERV ratings get greater, your ability to filter more out of the airstream increases. So as we take a look at the MERV 13 filter, that is when you look at the smallest particle size that they're rated for, they only pull out 50 to 74% of the smallest particle, which is 0.3 to 1 micron. So COVID-19 is smaller than that. And yes, there is some ability to pull COVID-19 out of the air with MERV 13, but it's drastically less than the 50 to 74%. Taking it one step further, when you look at the MERV 8 filter, that really isn't going to pull anything out. So our goal is to increase the filtration as high as we possibly can. In the perfect world, MERV 14 would be about the starting point. Now, that is a hospital grade filter, generally speaking, or not necessarily filter, but filtration level. That's typically what's provided to feed a lot of patient rooms that way. Talking about replacement frequency, what ends up happening, what we would propose there is, so the MERV 14 filter is an expensive filter. Realm of magnitude, somewhere between 150 and 250 bucks a piece-ish. So a lot of money compared to, if I remember right, $7 or $8, I believe was.
I think it was roughly around about that. We had the numbers. I didn't bring them with me tonight.
No worries.
I apologize.
Yep.
So it's a lot more costly than what the MERV 8 filter was. So what we typically end up doing is you provide a MERV 8 filter first before the air gets to that MERV 14 filter so that you preserve the life of the MERV 14 filter. You filter out the big boulders, so to speak, with the MERV 8 filter, and then the MERV 14 filter, you really are only concentrating on the really small things. And that extends the life of those filters, and then you can make it so that you likely won't end up needing to replace those MERV 14 filters maybe once a year, maybe once every other year. So you get a lot more life out of them, and you wouldn't be replacing them like you do if I remember right, you replace the MERV 8 3 times a year?
Well, they were at 3 times a year, and now we've increased our intervals so that they're looking at them more frequently.
Okay.
Because now we're diluting the outside air at a much more larger rate, which will require us to look at the filters obviously a little bit more.
And you're running equipment longer.
Right.
Also, right?
We're running it
Yes.
longer. Yep.
So I also included information on the HEPA and the filter that's better than the HEPA filter, once again, for informational purposes. In the perfect world, if money were no worry at all, you'd go with the best filter that you possibly can. And that guy is the one down at the bottom, and it filters out 99.59s, they call it, 99.999% efficient at 0.1 microns and greater. So it filters out pretty much everything.
Can our systems run those filters though, or run with those filters?
Do we have
the
what you've
horsepower?
got now? No.
Okay, just so everyone's clear on that it's on there is because it is in the range of filter technology, but our
But it's-
system is not
Correct.
there.
Correct. Right.
Yeah, Karen.
So if these are running and the room is empty, then that's probably one scenario. But if they're full of kids and a teacher, does it run the same with inhaling, exhaling, all of that? Does it matter whether the room is occupied or not?
Well, that's, I guess, kind of depending on the system, right? I mean, typically, if a room is filled with people, it gets warmer in there, right? So you're going to bring in more air typically. So your ventilation and air changes increase typically. So it's really dependent on load of the room, heat load. So that'll really increase it potentially.
And from a functional standpoint, if we're running these systems 24/7, like Scott had mentioned, as I'm thinking this through a little bit, as Scott had mentioned, we're turning the outside air off for portions of the night. We're not necessarily keeping the outside air all night long. Maybe we start at 2 hours before classes begin or before teachers arrive, and then we shut it off 2 hours after the last people leaving the buildings actually leave, which that I'm not sure what time that is. So that would be the biggest change there. When you do have students and teachers in the room though, you're generating more particles though, so there is a higher particle load on the space. So from a functional standpoint, you could think of it as overnight you're basically removing everything that you can with the filters in the room, and then as the day goes on, the room's getting more and more contaminated, I guess you could say. I don't like using that word, but it gives a negative connotation. It's just more filled.
Saturated?
Thank you. Much better term.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Can computers detect when there's greater saturation or not?
There are computers, no, but there are sensors that can be plugged into them that can determine number of particles within a space. Those end up being very specialized pieces of equipment that are pretty costly. But yeah, there are.
We don't have that right now. We don't have those sensors to help. We're setting up we're programming into each HVAC system the parameters of what we want to have happen according to a particular schedule. And we don't necessarily have sensors that are adjusting to that during the day.
No.
It's just whatever we think the best programming is, it'll do that.
Yes, and with those sensors too, those sensors are very costly. Your standard facilities, even your healthcare facilities, don't have those installed in such a manner where they just see what the particle counts are on the fly. It's something where only very specialized places within healthcare facilities actually end up seeing that, and that's only when they are undergoing certification. So in the pharmacies where they compound drugs that get injected into you intravenously, those rooms are certified and they actually do particle readings and such like that. But outside of that, you really don't see a lot of that. Does that help for the perspective?
Yes.
Thank you. How do you know when the filters are full?
Dirty?
Yeah.
You basically watch, as they get dirty, it becomes harder and harder for air to make its way through the filter. So what they've got this simple device, this $50 or $100 device that we saw on the side of the units at Rose Glen. It's called a magnet helix, and it measures how much pressure it is for the air to go through that filter. And you'll see what it is when you first put the filter in, and you know it's brand spanking new. And then you basically make the determination on knowing what the capacity limitations of the system are, basically how much capacity the fan has to push through that. So you'll either define what that final setting should be before you replace it, or generally speaking, what a lot of places do is if your initial pressure to push through that filter is 1/2 inch of water column is the units of measure that they use for that. They typically replace them at double that initial pressure drop. So you're really just watching for that pressure. You're seeing that pressure increase over time.
Right.
And it's something where it doesn't just spike immediately, it slowly builds over time. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, you're restricting, the air is getting restricted, not be able to go through, exactly.
Thank you.
And you guys are more on a regular schedule. You look at both those things, but on a regular schedule as well, is what I understand it, right?
And like I said, some of our new equipment, they have the digital control to where
Yep.
we're monitoring both sides of the filter, and as that pressure starts to increase that the fan's pulling against it, we'll get a notification saying, hey, this filter's dirty.
Yeah, that's what they're doing at the schools, the new construction stuff.
Yep.
That's very common in new construction, that you've got sensors that are tied to the building automation system that automatically notify people when the filters are dirty enough that they require replacement. So that, we can go to the next slide. This slide, we kind of talked about a little bit already. This was in reference to how big's the coronavirus, and can it be captured by air filters? Yes, it can be, and this talks more about it specifically. We've kind of already gone through that. If there are more questions about that, we can certainly talk about it. Otherwise, we can move on. So right in front of you right now, what we've got is a table that came from CDC. And what this talks about is the amount of air changes within a space and the time to remove 99% of those contaminants and 99.9% of those contaminants. All of this is predicated on MERV 14 filters in the air handling unit or air handling equipment. So these times work for MERV 14 filters. If you've got something less than MERV 14 filters, you would see just a greater time interval, and it would basically follow a similar layout as this. So what this is really saying is, after everybody has left the room for the night, how long would it take to remove 99 or 99.9% of those particles, contaminants within the space, whether they be the virus, whether they be dust or what have you. And I highlighted specifically as we talked or listening to the school board meetings, and there was made mention of somewhere between 6 and 13 air changes for the various facilities. That's what I highlighted specifically.
Right.
So as you look at that, with 6 air changes, which is relatively normal, that's to get 99.9% of those out of the space, it would take an hour and 10 minutes basically. So that's why it's important to run that equipment continuously. As we move to the next slide, we start talking about system cleaning. So the goal is to make sure that we've got clean systems so that we don't have more ability for the virus to get into nooks and crannies, so to speak. What we are looking at specifically here is a picture of the supply air stream at Rose Glen, and what it looks fuzzy, so to speak, not because it's dirty, but really what's there is an acoustical lining was provided as part of the original build. That acoustical lining is really meant to reduce the sound generated by the fans at the units, so that you can actually talk normally in the space without having to talk over really loud fans. For a facility of the age that this building was, I was pleased to see that, well, generally speaking, we've got a couple frayed edges, but it's not bad at all. There wasn't an appreciable amount of buildup on the actual lining of dust that you would kind of expect to see in a building that's as old as this.
Yeah, actually looked really good.
It did.
Yeah.
Now, the return air system, it's all return air plenum, so what that means is that the air moves through the space above the ceiling and it's not connected directly to ductwork. And then there are just a couple of collection points where there's a small ductwork system just above the ceiling with no grills in the room that just bring all the air back to the unit. That is dusty, and that has the amount of buildup that you would typically expect. But the positive side to that is that's why we've got air filters in the unit. When you take a look at the inside of the casing of the unit, quite honestly, the casing of the unit, once again, it's a built-up air handling unit. So what that means is that the contractor at the time brought all the parts and pieces, all the fan, all the casing to house the entire unit and built it up in that mechanical space. And generally speaking, that was for a unit of the age in which it was clean. So there wasn't much concern there. In the perfect world, having duct lining in the supplier stream from a COVID perspective, that does increase the risk a little bit. But if we end up removing this duct lining, that ends up where you may end up needing to add a duct silencer to make sure that the acoustics in the room don't become a problem.
Right.
We've got various temperature control strategies that are typically applied, and as we've gone through the various slides, we've talked through all of that. When we start talking about, there are other technologies that can be applied to, you can go to the next slide, sorry, Karen. They're not necessarily as new as what GPS is. UV lighting is one of those. Those systems can be designed to kill better than 99% of the virus the first time that virus particle moves past those lights. So it's got a very high efficiency. Now, that does mean that you've got to get the particle that was in the room back to the unit in front of those lights to kill it. Not an impossible thing, but that's where air change rates become more critical, and having as much air in the room as possible so that you have a greater ability to actually bring that back to, excuse me, to the equipment and get it in front of that UV light. UV lighting is a proven technology. There's ample research on it to indicate that it does kill exactly what they say it kills. They know exactly what the dosage is to kill COVID-19, so that system can be designed so that it can kill it on the fly. Now, it does have the negative impact in that you've got to replace the bulbs basically on a yearly basis. They're not the cheapest bulbs in the world, but after about 8,000 hours, they no longer are effective. One other thing I should make mention of too, UV lighting does kill a lot more than just COVID-19. If you've got mold or other viruses or bacteria, it will kill them as well. And if there were one in particular that you were concerned over, that could be reviewed more in detail, but it does give you a whole lot of latitude that way. On the slide right now, what we've got shown there is a number of these UV robots. This is kind of what they're talking.
Yeah, this one's just kind of a fun one, and see if
Yes.
it's an option.
It's an option. So right now I know that you're using that misting solution. I remember hearing made references to a Ghostbuster like backpack and such.
Right.
So this type of device would replace that. What you do with this is you'd roll it into a room. Nobody can be in the room when you would roll this in, but you would turn it on, and within 10 minutes it would basically disinfect that room. Yes?
Aaron, I think maybe talked about it. What about the shadows where it's not reaching?
Part of the reason, or part of what they do with this is, that's why the lights are as tall as they are. Shadows are critical that way because it's not perfect, but they do basically go from the floor. I want to say that these are like 6 or 7 feet tall, so they are pretty tall. And like the one that's second from the right, that guy I've seen at a couple healthcare facilities, and it basically starts only a couple inches up off the floor. So as long as it can see it, so they do whatever they can to increase the ability for that UV light to actually see that surface, and then it does disinfect it. The cost on these things as a realm of magnitude, because that's usually helpful just for perspective. A single one of these for the first 3. Oh, before I go into the cost, one other thing I should make mention of too. The one that's on the far left, that one's actually produced in Waukesha, which I thought was kind of interesting more than anything else. realm of magnitude, somewhere around $25,000 a piece for one of those. They can be set up or purchased so that they've got a device which goes along and will measure the dosage within the dosage of UV light that's provided to the space and let you know that it's been sanitized, and then provide record-keeping purposes as well. And what they found with this is that within that small table, which I know is really small text on here, it's basically the certification saying that after 10 minutes exposure, it's killed 99.995, if I remember right, 99.999% of COVID. So very effective. You can go to the next slide, please. Yes.
So picturing that, would it be one person just putting it in a classroom after 10 minutes or 15 minutes, going in, getting that, moving it, and rotating it if there was one per school?
Yes, that is kind of exactly how it would go. Actually, let's back up a second. There's a couple things I could add to that too. So the first three, those are just on wheels that an individual would actually roll into the room. Typically, if this were something that there was a real interest in, what you would typically do is provide two of those. They kind of work in pairs. That way you can set one in one corner or in one area of a room and another in a different area. And then together, they kind of work as a primary and a secondary to each other. So it's considered one system, but they work together to decontaminate that space. But yeah, after the 10-minute time, somebody would need to physically roll it over to the next room, stick it in there for 10 minutes, and kind of go from room to room. One of the nice things about these, though, is if you did have a classroom where somebody was suspected of having COVID-19, you could roll this into the room after the students have left, whether it be lunch or you just, you know what, we're taking everybody out of here, we're moving them to a different space for a period of time, roll that equipment in, set it up, let it run for its 10-minute duration, and then the room would basically be sanitized again. So that is, yes?
Sorry, you started a new sentence.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Is it like an X-ray machine where the person who's rolling it, after they turn it on and then leave the room, is in danger? How do you make sure you're not in there? I've heard that the eyes.
Yes. So it is kind of like getting a sunburn if you were to actually be in the room. So no, you don't want to be in the room when it's going on. Glass does filter it, so you don't, as long as you're behind glass, you're fine from that perspective, protected from that perspective. They do have little countdown timers so that, I forget if it's, and I'm pretty sure you can set that up too, where you set it for a 15-second countdown, and after you hit start, it counts down, you leave the room, and then it lights itself up, goes through its 10-minute cycle, turns off. With the system that's on the second to the left, that one comes with an iPad or an iPad-like device that communicates with it and then lets you know, hey, we're done. I believe you can also start it with that handheld device as well. The one that's on the far right-hand side, that one is one where you would not need to have a person roll that into the room. That one is, think of a Roomba type device.
Yeah.
They're more costly. I couldn't find a lot of information. Those companies aren't necessarily the most responsive, but it looks as though those would be have a cost of somewhere between $50,000 to $80,000 a piece, and they can be pre-programmed paths and whatnot. And they've got sensors to make sure nobody's in the room, make sure nobody's in front of it or is running into things, so they're pretty advanced from that perspective. Yes?
I don't know if you can answer this, but are you able to compare the effectiveness of the UV compared to what we are using, the spray? I guess effectiveness number one as far as time, because I think we were told this room would take about 30 seconds to spray.
Okay.
The girl's supposed to.
Yeah.
And then the effectiveness of that spray compared to.
From that perspective, that I don't know. I don't have any of the specifics on the spray that you're using, and quite honestly, I hadn't asked.
Okay.
So it's something where we may be able to make that determination if we had all the information, but right now I don't have that information handy.
Fair enough, thank you.
From everything I've heard, though, with that, there was a big concern making sure nobody was around when that was being dispersed, though, if I remember right. Does that sound right?
Yes.
So as we move on to bipolar ionization, so I'll call it BPI for short. This has been around for a while as well. It's something where they first used it to break down odors in spaces. That's the first time, or the first use of this, and they found that it's also fairly effective in killing viruses, bacteria as well. With this equipment, when you're actually comparing its use for killing molds, bacteria, and viruses, there isn't a lot of research that actually indicates anything. So because it's a newer use for that technology, there's less supporting information about it. And when there's less supporting information, you just have to make sure you look at it with a critical eye and don't necessarily take everything that the manufacturer states for granted. A lot of that may have marketing spin on it from that perspective. Now, I don't want to say that it's not a tool. It is certainly a tool in the tool belt, but that shouldn't be an only tool type of scenario. It's something where it can enhance other approaches, but it shouldn't be the only approach. Some other technology that for possible consideration too. So when we start talking about unit ventilators, there isn't like we have in this room here. The fans that are in those don't have a lot of capability for speeding up to get more oomph out of them, so to speak, so that you can actually push through those better filters. So what you may end up looking at for rooms like this is a portable room recirculating unit, which basically you can get them with HEPA filters in them, you can get them with UV, you could get them with BPI pre-installed in them. They just plug into a 120 volt outlet in the wall, and then that way you can get your increased air change rates in the rooms that way. Humidification's on the list as well. That's on the list because what they found is that people are more susceptible to catching various sicknesses, so to speak, when your humidification levels drop in the winter. And typically what they like to see is within a range of between 40 and 60% relative humidity. In the winter, when we get really cold outside, you can be into the single digit relative humidity percentages, especially indoors. Now, humidification also you've got to be careful where that's applied. When you've got old buildings that weren't necessarily designed to be able to handle humidification, you can actually, if you humidify a building like that, you can actually end up destroying the building. And basically what ends up happening then is the freeze thaw occurs at the wall with the water that you put in the air. So you literally, it kind of crumbles around you. The only other thing I wanted to make mention of on that slide is that I did include the link to some information on ASHRAE about some other technologies that are out there and their pros and cons. So that may be a source if somebody wanted something more specifically, or at least wanted to take a look at it. And then if you had questions, you can certainly feel free to ask from that point. The last closing thought I would have on that before we go into any additional questions is, so what we would really propose if we were given, say, like Kurt had mentioned earlier, the $1.5 million to $2 million, what you do first is you make sure that you've got the outside air rates in each of the schools at what they're supposed to be. You do whatever you can to increase your total air changes in the space. And then you look at filtration levels and trying to get to a MERV 14 filter, because MERV 14 filter actually starts having a greater impact on your ability to remove those very fine particles that, like COVID-19, to get it out of the space. And then after you've done those, then it would make sense to start looking at other technologies, like BPI or UV or what have you. The unfortunate thing is, though, in order to, so at Rose Glen that we had gone to, we had found that what we would do there specifically, as a specific example, we'd replace the filter rack that's in there right now inside the 2 air handling units. We would go ahead and install a high efficiency MERV 8 filter and then a very high efficiency MERV 14 filter. And when I say efficiency when it comes to filters, I'm not talking about their ability to remove contaminants. I'm talking about having a very low impact on the pressure it takes to push through it. Because the lower impact that we can have on that, the better chance that we've gotten actually being able to get those filters installed without negatively impacting other operations.
Air changes and whatnot.
Yes.
Right.
So I'm going to summarize your summary maybe. There are things that we should do first that are basic things that we may have done some, we may not have done all of them, before we really consider some of these other sophisticated technologies, because these systems need to be working appropriately, what we have.
Yes.
And we need to maximize that in order for these other technologies to be effective. So there really is an order. You don't want to bring in a new technology if you don't have some of the basic things already taken care of, is what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
You summarized that very well.
Yep.
So, yes, Jim.
So it's safe to say the 3 things that you'd recommend, those are good, COVID-19 or not.
Yes.
Those are just good, practical things to have.
Yes.
Other question I have is, when you just think about, like, even this room, there's 12 of us in this room wearing masks.
Mm-hmm.
So if we weren't wearing masks, any idea the amount of particles and things that these filters are cleaning comparatively to when you have a room full of people that are wearing masks?
That's a difficult thing to answer in reality. The filter doesn't know if we're wearing a mask or if we're not wearing a mask from that perspective, so it treats the air regardless and does its best job of filtering everything out. If you're talking about the risk based on filtration level, yes, your overall risk goes down. I can't quantify exactly how much it goes down as you put better filters in, especially in that it's just dependent on so many other variables that have nothing to do with HVAC. How much somebody touches a surface who may have it, and if somebody else touches it and then touches their eyes or what have you, they may catch it that way and have no impact on. I don't really have a really good answer for you from that perspective.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
were you asking basically, is the mask a pre-filtered filter, right? Is that kind of your question, right? So the mask is the first level of filtration before we get to what we
Yes.
talked about, our MERV 8 filter, was just saving the more expensive filters, right? So
Yes.
I guess it could be thought of that way, right? Makes sense.
But we don't know
We don't know.
how that would impact
We
the
don't know how it would
overall
impact.
system.
Yeah, we
No.
don't.
There's not studies out there that give us
No.
that information.
At least not as of yet. And I haven't heard of anybody actually doing a study like that. It does bring up some interesting questions, though. Because
It really
it does kind of, anecdotally, it makes a lot of sense where that could have an
I could see it being a difficult question to answer,
Yes.
because it's all about proper mask fit, wearing, how much you're
Uh-huh.
wearing it, how much different kinds of masks, everyone's got different styles, so that's a very difficult question.
One big takeaway that I took from the education that they provided just through this process is, in my position and Tim's position and Joe's position, we're getting emails from the sales guys of these ionization systems. And your question is that the right solution for the district, or is that the right solution for them to increase their sales, right? So I think just going through this process just help me understand that maybe in the right application, that ionization. And when they were explaining it to me, it was like, well, boy, bipolar ionization, that sounds so much more technological, like that's the technical solution, right? Because it sounds so good, right?
Yeah.
Compared to filtration, that's just so old school. But what I came to the conclusion based on their information is sticking with the basics and starting there with the filtration piece before making a big investment into ionization may make the most sense.
Now, we did not hire you, though, to go out to each site and to look at each site. I mean, you saw Rose Glen.
Right.
And
Yes.
there were some things that were cleaner than what we
Yes.
thought. But you may run into another school that might not be as clean as what we thought it would be. So would you recommend that really our next step would be is to, have Tim and Darren and his team be going out to each location? Would we perhaps, Darren, be hiring a consultant to do that and to do that analysis? Or is this something, Joe, that you could just build in with your team on your tasks, the daily tasks, monthly tasks, semi-annual, annual kinds of things, where you start to look more closely at these things? Would we require a consultant for that, or can we do that on our own? This is a question. That might be a manpower thing, that might be a knowledge thing, maybe both.
I'd say it's a good combination of both. I was telling Kirk before we went to Rose Glen that I wasn't confident with some of the equipment that I had, and I had some work that I've done in the past where it was quality control, and my gosh, if I want to go do something, I want to make sure I can prove that I'm doing what I'm reading and bringing it back to not only the Board of Education, but providing what I'm doing to the staff and the students that attend these facilities too, so it would be a combination of both manpower and
And we run pretty thin as a staff in general.
Sure.
And people might not realize that out in the audience that, actually, most of our administration, we run pretty thin. It doesn't really matter which department you're looking at. And we appreciate, how everyone works so hard. I just had to ask that question, Joe.
That's not a problem. I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
So what would be that next step then if we wanted to take a step? Because right now, I mean, what I'm taking from this is these other technologies that are more advanced, we really need to be looking at that in the future. There's other things that we should be taking care of now. So how do we go about doing that, or what would you recommend on that?
I think that first step of what we were coming to answer was the bipolar ionization. That's something we want to move forward. There's some districts out there that made that knee-jerk reaction, and so we got to do something and put money into it. We don't fully know what the effects of putting bipolar ionization in those schools is going to be, and how much it's really going to help. But that was kind of our first step of, do we go with bipolar ionization, or do we make a more systematic approach to this? And so that's the first piece. And then if the district wants to take that next step, then in my opinion, what the route would be to have it a combined effort between an engineering company such as Ring and Do to go through like they did at Rose Glen and look at each school. Like I said, their outcomes of Rose Glen was the filtration, engineering a different filtration rack so they can hold those better filters in it. And along with that, and what that would look like is they would go through and engineer that and put a bid document together that would then get bid out. And then they could do that for every school if it's something that was going to be funded as far as a priority.
Yeah, Tim's not, well, one of our facilities had made it so Tim couldn't be here tonight. So things do happen in facilities, that's for sure. But I'd like to come back with a plan, because we talked about, do we break this down into pieces, trying to fit it into, because we don't have the $2 million, well, anything's possible based on priorities, right?
Right.
But assuming we don't have a $2 million check coming just for this purpose, do we break it down by elementary or maybe secondary? I even asked the question, if, as engineers, is there a level of school, meaning high school, middle, or elementary, that you would start with because of the importance of, so, but I do think we do a roof analysis. We hire a third-party company to come in and check out our roofs and asphalt and all these other areas. And I don't see this being any different than that, of getting a baseline report and then developing a plan of how to go about addressing it, because I think there's some low-hanging fruit compared to the cost of bipolar ionization, at least that's what I'm hearing, that we can start to make improvements. We won't get it all done in a month or anything, but systematically just going through it and getting some major steps forward for us. So that would be my plan, or recommendation would be to have someone come in and give us that baseline data. And then also everyone knows where we're at. Not sending Joe out to be the gospel sayer of every measure, because I don't think it's fair to put him in that position as the inside person. I think a third-party analysis of our buildings is a fair step forward. So,
Questions or comments on that? I think that's a great approach. So, I see some other heads nodding. That would be a direction we might go in. Okay. All right.
well, hopefully you saw why I didn't give this report. So I do appreciate the engineers from Ring and Do for coming in tonight to help us through all this. And Joe, thanks again for
Oh, you're
your
welcome.
time, and Kurt.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Helped tremendously.
Good, glad to hear it.
Have a good night.
Have a great evening.
Right.
This meeting is open to the public if you would like to stay. I don't want to be a rude host here, so. No, one of these times, someone will stay.
Good try, Darren. All right, moving on to our second discussion item, the monthly budget report. Sherry?
Okay. I feel like a broken record on the monthly budget report so far this year, because it just is, there's just no comparing it from year to year. It's just such a unique year. But I'll go through some of the quick highlights. The good news is there isn't anything jumping out right now, but as we will report later on in some of the COVID costs we've already experienced, we expect it to get a little uglier as the year goes on. But we'll talk about that later in the COVID cost report. Right now, for our revenues, our local sources are picking up a little bit, the student fees and things, but still lagging considerably behind what we'd have with a normal year. As we're working toward our final budget, I'm going to look at adjusting some of those down, because I think that we're not going to hit those targets this year. Same thing to go with like the pay to ride, that's down quite a bit now with the secondary schools going back 4 days. That's probably going to help that a little bit, because right now they're prorated to 2 days a week. So those students riding the bus, that rate will be brought back up. They haven't charged anybody yet for the fees because of this situation. They just wanted to wait to see where we are going to be at by the end of October. Our interest continues to be extremely low, and I think even though I budgeted low, I'm going to have to drop it even further in the final budget, because it's abysmal would be the word I would use to describe that.
Yeah, the local government investment pool right now, which is a very standard investment vehicle for schools or governmental bodies to use, is at 0.13% interest. So it's hardly worth the journal entry some months. So.
Right. And usually that's up in the one of our higher investments. The good news is with our referendum money, we had invested a lot of the money into CDs before everything tanked. So we're still earning some pretty nice interest on the Fund 43 money as those CDs mature. Now, as they mature, the interest is low, but we did make money on it.
I think we locked in like at 2% or,
Some were higher.
there was
than
different
that.
terms, so it's all over the place, but 2 on average probably.
Agreed. Okay. For our intermediate sources, we received a payment for Carl Perkins over for some summer expenditures that we had. Our state sources received our first equalization aid of $7.9 million and early college credit payment, which is just a different program that we get reimbursed for, of $11,000. Other sources, there were just a lot of miscellaneous things in here, nothing big, but insurance claim, damage reimbursements, contract liquidations, and lost badges fees were about the only things that we saw in the other sources. Overall, we're at a similar percentage of collections as we were at this time, but our equalization aid is coming out higher than what we had expected it to be in our original budget, which is going to flip-flop the taxes and the equalization aid in the final budget. But so when you're comparing the percentages of budget spent, it is a little bit low right now until we get our final figures. From the expenditures, same note as last month is that we don't have the carryover added to the budget yet, which is about $1 million, and a little under $1 million. So that is going to change before the final budget comes out. Overall salary and benefits, they're aligning with where we had expected them to be when we did the original budget, but we'll hit more under the COVID costs of things like eAchieve right now. The enrollment is high, therefore they had to hire more teachers. That's going to have to be reflected in the final budget and some updates there. So that'll all be, like I said, for our final budget meeting. Purchase services, right now, it's mainly the technology still, subscriptions, license fees, nothing under purchase services that really relate to COVID. The biggest payment was $60,000 to MultiView, which is the platform that's used for digital marketing for eAchieve. Non-capital objects, there's a lot of activity, but it's mainly for all the COVID-19 type of things we're spending money on, the PPEs, the disinfectants, all of that kind of fun stuff. And again, we'll get into that in a little more detail in the COVID report. Capital objects really continues to just be technology purchases of Apple purchases and things like that, but we had an expense for something called Cisco room kits for $100,000 this month, and I would have to dig into that a little further. I don't recall what the Cisco kits are for, but I believe I know they have to do with the virtual learning type things, but I couldn't be specific on what they do. Pardon? I think it's one of those. Oh, thank you. Okay, there you go.
You brought a great prop, Sherry.
I planned it that way, yep. Normally I look into those, but I was going to look into that one, and then I forgot after the report was done. For debt retirement, we had nothing in Fund 10 for debt retirement, but we did make in September our October 1st interest payments for all of our Fund 38 and Fund 39 debt. So 3 different interest payments were made out of those funds. Transfers, no transfers. Other objects, just minimal activity, mainly professional dues. Overall, our spending for September came in close to last year, but I just think it's different. The feel is different to it this year than it's been in years past, and with mainly the what do we need to do right now to keep everything safe. Fund 27, similar thing. Fund 27 isn't as impacted right now by COVID expenditures other than eAchieve. They need more teachers for eAchieve. I'm sorry, insurance. I missed unemployment. I just want to talk about that a little bit. Looked like a massive unemployment insurance payment, but that was really going back to still paying out August. So we pay a month in arrears. So the bill we pay in September was for claims through August, and it actually was July and August. So it was a lot higher. Now, we're still expecting to get a big rebate on this unemployment insurance, but it's still just unclear how that's going to happen. I'm actually going to a virtual seminar tomorrow to learn more about some of these types of rebates that we're going to be getting, so I'm hoping to have more information on that. But in the meantime, we're just paying it and hoping that it comes back. A good chunk of it, I had heard 50% or more of what we're spending we should be getting back because of some of the government funding. So that's good news. Fund 27, no revenue yet. We really don't start seeing Fund 27 revenue until November. Expenditures, salary and benefits, same as Fund 10. We're going to have to be adjusting those for the eAchieve staff that's come on board. Purchase services, mainly our CISA contract. We already talked about that earlier. And then tuition to private schools. Supplies, non-capital objects, really school supplies. Not much to talk about there. No capital purchases and insurance. Of the money that, when we pay our our unemployment compensation, it all gets paid to Fund 10, and then we figure out how much needs to go back to Fund 27, and we haven't done that journal entry yet, but there'll be some of that Fund 10 money moved over to Fund 27 because that is an aidable expense. So if we can recapture it, it's a good thing because we get aid on it then. Hard to draw too many parallels, but I think we're within reason of where we expect to be, but we have more conversation on the budget impacts in a little bit here. So Fund 43 just continues to be our big construction bills coming in from all the work we did over the summer. Any questions on that part? Otherwise, we can go to the health insurance slides, but any questions on the budget?
I think we're good.
Okay. I didn't put in the tax levy page just because we had the final one last month that showed all the taxes collected, so I didn't want to waste more paper. You'll get a new and revised one as soon as we get the levies all set. So for the insurance, the self-funded dental, going good. We're starting to see claims as we had expected, and people are starting to go back to see the dentist, and the same thing with the health. Now, on the health side, would have expected to see more claims by now, but it's still relatively slow. I don't know if it's just that procedures are still being, I know people, I have a friend who's been waiting for a knee replacement and has been on hold through this whole COVID thing because it wasn't critical surgery. So I think there's still more of those things waiting out there, but right now our claims experience has been shockingly good, but I still am waiting for.
Yeah, we may see a different pattern this year.
Yeah.
As COVID gets under more control and people get more comfortable,
That's what I expect too.
So we just don't know where people's comfort levels are at and when they're going to feel comfortable starting up. I mean, I know I've personally gone to the doctor, and I've have some family members but for a long time we were hesitant, and then we felt like, well, we need to do this now. So that's all based on personal situations, though. So that's really hard to predict that.
And we did, our balance in this account was much higher than we would normally be able to carry over, but because of COVID, our auditors looked at that as an exception because they understand we're going to be potentially seeing a much higher claims volume. But if we get to the end of the year, or when we get to the point where COVID is settled down a bit and claims are getting back to normal more, we'll have to look at that balance if it's still large and make decisions about it. Questions?
Very good.
Yeah.
Moving on to our third discussion item, an update on our 2021 budget and levy development. We've had some pieces of information come in that helped. You had mentioned one earlier, the
We have
property equalization values. So,
well, we haven't gotten the final equalization, the October 15th. That's our magic date 3 days from now, we'll have our aid certification saying the final amount. But the fact that that first payment came in so much higher leads me to believe that we're going to be.
That our estimate was conservative, and we'll have to
Correct.
raise that up. Sure.
Yep, and so as we look at the new scenarios, first let me talk a little bit about what are the pieces we do know. Equalized value, how the land value's been certified, and we had an increase of 4.65%. I had made a very conservative estimate this year at 1%, and so this is really good news because it basically means that the mill rate's going to come down because of that. Computer aid is holding, but that we've known. They're just not changing that amount anymore. It's been locked in for a couple years. Personal property aid looks to be holding at the same value also. Our energy efficiency exemption is our final year for this because our final energy exemption payment will be in April. So that's our Fund 38 debt that will go away at the end of this year. But our exemption for this year is $841,388. Our refunded rescinded taxes adjustment is coming in about $50,000, and then our final enrollment from the third Friday count to calculate the ADM has been put in there, and it's down, which is disheartening, more than projected. We had projected 100 loss of ADM. ADM is the average daily membership. It's where we look at the figure that's averaged the last 3, or this year and the prior 2 years. It isn't, this is our third Friday count number, this is the average, and that's what's used to calculate our revenue limit. So our average is down by 285.
And what was the assumption
Students.
we made? Was it 100 or 125?
100, I think it was flat 100 or 109. I can't remember
okay.
off the top. But I think it was an even 100.
Okay.
So it's quite a bit higher. On the flip side, though, we'll see that later when we talk, our open enrollment numbers are good, very good to help offset some of this. But from our revenue limit perspective, it's for this year, and I'll go into it in a little bit, it's not hurting us as much this year because of such a big drop. We had an additional exemption called hold harmless, which isn't we're not feeling that drop this year as much, but as the years go on, depending what happens with our enrollment, we get a sudden increase again because people are coming back. It could be a little painful next year, so we'll be watching that. The pieces we're still waiting for. We're waiting for the school choice pupil adjustment. That's the voucher program kids. We need to know what that is, but that becomes kind of a wash because the exact amount of our exemption for that has to be budgeted as an expenditure. So no matter what it comes in at, it ends up being kind of a wash on either side. We're waiting for our transfer of service amount, and then we're waiting for basically the October 15th certification piece. That's the biggie. We hope to have everything by October 15th, and we'll have the final budget book ready by the meeting for the 26th. And then just a couple of things to note as we go through this. Our final budget, and the preliminary budget, we never put the carryover in there, but we always add it to the final budget. And in this case, it's $952,090 that we're carrying over from last year. It is a bit larger than our normal carryover. The sites pretty much stopped spending their site budgets in March, and so they have a lot more site budget money being carried over. But we also have common school funds. We've always encouraged the libraries to spend their money in that year, and they just, March came and they stopped spending. And so there's over $100,000 of common school fund carryover that we don't normally have. So that's in there.
And overall, that was a strategy that our district was taking, is let's slow down in March
Yes.
on our expenditures. We're really not sure how COVID's going to impact us. We're not sure if we're going to get funding from the state or federal government. We're not sure how much we need to spend on mitigation efforts for cleaning supplies and masks and all those kinds. So we had tons of question marks. So what you're saying is we basically followed the strategy, right? I mean, people were pretty good at following the strategy of slowing down our expenses and really only, perhaps buying the things that we need to buy.
In talking with the principals too early on, we never promised them they'd get all their carryover either. because we didn't know what our cost structure was going to be. We ended up giving them all of their carryover, just like we would calculate it in a full year. But we also know they're incurring expenditures at their buildings this year. I couldn't name them, but you know it's there. Whether it's specific PPE for a unique program or something that's just not on our radar at this level. So in my mind, I think the costs will be there to justify allowing them to have the full carryover, because it did jump significantly. It's a completely different ballgame, but I think it's worked out. I think it's given them some flexibility at the sites, and gave us flexibility up until this time where we could make a decision, so.
Okay.
Okay. So on the good news front, though, is we did have a large contribution to fund balance in 1920. Right now, when we take carryover out of it, we're looking at 4.6 million. But again, it's due to the strategies that you had discussed. We intentionally did some things to save that money, not knowing what was going to happen. The good news is there wasn't a budget repair bill for this year, so we didn't get hit hard this year. But all predictions are that next year is going to be a difficult year, and it'll be good to have a little extra in fund balance to potentially rely on. We also do expect that we're going to spend more money out of it this year, given all of the things that we have to continually buy to battle COVID and the changes we keep having to make. So this is where we're kind of looking for your feedback. We're not necessarily, the budget isn't going to necessarily reflect all of those things up front because they're still unknown. So what we'd like to take the approach where, as these things come up and we're going to need to tap into that balance, that we would bring it forward to the board as a budget amendment and seek board approval at that time, versus going in and just arbitrarily holding off some money, saying, oh, I think I'm going to need another $500,000 for PPEs or whatever, and budgeting for that if we don't necessarily know that we need it right now. So I'm just looking for your feedback on, are you okay with that approach, knowing that we are going to be coming back and asking to tap into some of this surplus throughout the year? But it seems to make more sense to do it that way than to just put it in the budget and assume we're going to spend it.
We will probably in the final budget, we'll budget, even if it means using some of these dollars to cover payroll, because we're figuring out what our true staffing is now. So we'll cover our fixed costs that we know we've already locked in and loaded, but Sherry's point is a good one. I don't know if I'm super comfortable with saying, you know what, I think I might need $1 million set off to the side for something, or do we come back to you? Now, with that caveat of administratively, we need to make decisions, and the board's been fantastic through this whole thing, knowing that we make decisions and oftentimes are reporting back to you after the fact, but that's just the way this thing works. We're fine either way. I don't have a preference, but I did want Sherry to raise it today, just to have you give it some thought.
Sure.
On how you would like us to, because we have the COVID report coming up. That might be a monthly report or every other month, just kind of updating you on where we are and what we're facing. So
what you're saying, so typically during the year, we have 2 dates that we set aside for amendments, right? And where we talk about that. And those have been relatively small and more predictable kinds of things. And
almost housekeeping in a lot of cases.
Right.
Grants.
So you want to
allocations
use
change.
that system, and maybe perhaps more than twice a year, we might have a few different times throughout the year where you'll come forth and you'll say, hey, this is what we're thinking, that we need to make an amendment to our budget. So you're looking at that being the process that we go through. So comments, questions on that? Thoughts?
And just not on the expenditure side, there's some significant revenue potentially
Sure.
coming that we don't know.
Sure, it's anything in the budget.
We're filing
right?
claims with FEMA for some of these costs. FEMA's never been involved with anything like this before, so we don't know if we're going to get no cents on the dollar or 20 cents on the dollar. And our claim right now, we think, is at least $500,000. ESSER is pretty well defined, but the benefit of the ESSER funds is we have some time to spend those dollars. So we're leading with the FEMA claim, find out what gets reimbursed, to keep the ESSER funds, which we have 2 years.
We have through September 20th, 2022.
And then there's this whole unemployment thing that we keep hearing about, but boy, I'd like to hear more about it. So there might be some revenue budget adjustments, so
Sure.
it's not all outgoing.
Sure.
That's my point.
I mean, I like the amendment process for this, because we can have that as many times as we want. We don't have to just have, an agendized item every 6 months or twice a year. So we can bring it up when you need to bring it up. So there's flexibility in the timing of it. It can cover any aspect, revenue or expenditure. And, we can do that what I hear you saying is, as you get more information, you can be better at telling us really what this is for, as opposed to just kind of doing a guess right now for the whole year. Is that really what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't want you to authorize, I guess I'm less comfortable just asking for a blank check on something like this.
Yeah.
I don't think it serves either of us well. But there's a scenario, I think, in looking at these, and I'm sorry, there's going to be a lot of numbers we're throwing at you tonight. Open enrollment is doing great. FEMA might come through. Unemployment reimbursement might come through. So I may never come back to you and ask to tap into those reserves, because I do think next year is a bigger financial concern than this year. So it might not ever happen. So why even dive into it in a budget on the front end? Yeah, so again, we're fine no matter what. We don't have a horse in the race really on this one, so.
The only thing to consider, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The only thing to consider is that we just have to post. There's legal postings required for when we have to do
Sure.
do budget amendments, but it's just the cost of the ad, which is pretty insignificant.
Right. Corey?
Thank you. I do agree with you, Mr. Komos. I just think we'd like to see that, what's coming. Like you said, Mr. Clark, it may not happen, but in case it does, it'd be good to see that and go through the amendment
It'll be a
process.
friendly reminder to us to keep you up to date on all the things going on too.
Yeah.
Because once the year gets going, sometimes you just kind of get lost in the waves. So, but we will bring you a budget that will cover the costs that we can identify clearly on the 26th. So that might include some of that fund balance. We'll be able to tell you. That's what we're working on now, because the October 15th payroll has been posted. But anything beyond that benchmark of the 26th, I think will be a report out to you and action if needed.
Diane?
So with the budget, October 26th, are we ready to make settlements with the different employee groups as far as establishing pay
we're-
raises for the year, et cetera?
We're HR committee's meeting on Wednesday to kind of rekindle the conversations. We were ready to start meeting pre-COVID, which is a measure of time now. So we're ready to resume those conversations now based on the guidance that committee gives us.
And the budget was developed with a estimated amount in it that had in there as, this is what we think it's going to be, but until we know what it was, that money was also there as potentially a backup if it was needed for something else. But once, that the impact won't be huge, because we already have a part of that in the budget. The other thing that we're looking to get out of this year is Darren's brought forward the Hawthorne renovations that are needed, and so there would be $250,000 in this year that would need to come out to help fund that particular
Because that
project.
project will cross fiscal years. We talked about that last month. So this is the portion that will fall within the 2021 school year, because our fiscal year ends in June and the construction won't be done in June.
Right.
So the following year will also have a contribution to that project.
Is that roughly $750,000 for the
We
subsequent
have
year?
$1 million placeholder, but we'll be bidding out the work right after the first of the year. So we'll really be able to, for the 21-22 number, we'll be able to really come up with a specific number.
All right.
This is, the 250,000 is just kind of based off a very rough cash flow project progression that we've done.
Sure.
But next year we'll be able to fine tune that.
Fair enough.
Then if we want to look at the scenario chart, basically it's got last year's actuals. It has what our preliminary scenario was, the one that was a little more pessimistic. And then the middle scenario includes our July 1st equalization aid estimate and the correct values for the third Friday count. And so, given that our base revenue limit from last year has increased by $803,000, now, when you look at that, there's something in there now called a hold harmless exemption, about the middle of the top section, $703,000. So that's accounting for a large portion of that increase, and that's because of the rather large drop in our third Friday count numbers. That goes away as things start to level off on. So that can be, it's good the year you get it, but it can cause some heartaches depending what happens with our enrollment in the next couple of years.
We're actually in a place in the revenue limit where losing more kids gives us more money for 1 year. Up completely contrary to any normal thought. We usually talk about one more kid's $10,000, right?
It's to offset a big drop,
Yep.
right? I mean, that's the
Correct.
purpose of it.
And then as we grow, we're actually going to have less money because these exemptions fall off. But yet that kid who's new isn't part of the 3-year average yet. That first year, they're only 1/3. And that's where that gap. So as enrollment starts going down, we'll actually lose revenue, but we're gaining revenue so it's exactly opposite of what you think it should be.
So,
Because if you look at our base revenue, which is that top line, we've lost, $400,000 in base revenue based off that average ADM. But because of the exemptions that have come into play, we actually have increased the revenue limit.
so would there be a way to perhaps put together a sinking fund for that? I mean, there's multiple factors that change, so it's not like an easy calculation sinking fund, but could there?
Sinking fund in terms of reserves set aside to offset
Yeah.
that?
So we know that we have the $703,511 in hold harmless, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know that essentially what enrollment. It would deal with enrollment projections
Mm-hmm.
too in general. I mean, you'd have to be making any assumption going forward, but we know that $703,000 is going to catch up with us soon, over time. So could we kind of just take those hold harmless amounts, and have we had other hold harmless amounts within the last 5 years or last 3 years?
We've
really?
actually had just come out of hold harmless.
Yep.
And now we dove right back into it because that was kind of a liberating, because once you have that, and I think hold harmless generally would drop out first.
Yes.
Once you get out of it, when you start to grow, you go back to the thinking of more kids is more money. So it's a parachute on the way down, but it's 100 pounds on your shoulders as you're trying to climb out of it. So
You got to get momentum to get back into it.
But to answer
Yeah.
your specific question, I think we have a sinking fund with the savings we had from last year, the $4.5 or $6 million, because this $700,000 of additional money is going to be used to pay off expenditures this year and help buy us out of our COVID exposure. And to me, that allows us to use that $4.6 million later on, kind of a sinking fund, to help us get through that problem at that time. In my mind, it all becomes one pool of money.
Yeah, but it's going to be used for many, many things. I just didn't know if we wanted to sort of earmark it, if you wish.
The board can always designate fund balance for whatever purpose. We had the final settlement of the OPEB investment thing that we set aside for OPEB obligations for years to come. It's nowhere near funding our OPEB, but it was a smart play by the board at that time. And you always have that right as a board to set aside fund balance for understanding that sometimes you'll need a supermajority to get the money out of it. And it's not always as clean as you would think. But so this is a good thing for this year. I think Sherry and I agree. We're just stressing the importance of next year and really the years to follow with our enrollment doing what it is. And I put a chart on your desk, which is the red line is what I shared as a projection in 2016. The blue line's where we're actually at, and it's significantly lower. Now, I was holding this because later on we're going to be talking about open enrollment. I don't know if you can trust that we're really this low. With COVID and everything going on, I don't know if some of this is Some of it is the natural trend of loss of kids, and that's undeniable by every study and our experience. But I think this might have been a bigger drop because of COVID, and I don't have any scientific proof or a study to tell you that's what's happening. But just like I think when we look at the open enrollment numbers, which are fantastic, I think they're artificially high because of COVID. I think a lot of families migrated to eAchieve because they didn't want to go into brick and mortar, which I certainly respect. So the data's kind of, it's there, but I'm not sure, you're not sure what you're looking at sometimes.
So as an example is someone might homeschool this year, but they don't want to do it next year. That would be an example of that.
And one thing to point out on these exemptions, you'll see that there's actually two that deal with declining enrollment. One is hold harmless and one is your declining enrollment exemption. The declining enrollment exemption stays on a little bit longer. The hold harmless is there to really help you in a year where you have a big drop.
The 1 year wonder.
Right. So while you'll see we've had declining enrollment forever, and we will, as the enrollment continues to decline, we'll always have some sort of declining enrollment. But the hold harmless is that, boy, this year was a big hit. We're going to keep you from really feeling the effects of it. Because, even if our students have dropped, doesn't mean we can equally turn around and say, okay, that means we can get rid of this many teachers, right? Because those number of students are spread out across a large district. So it may be only 1 or 2 students per a class. That doesn't mean you can easily reduce the class size. So it's not an easy fix when you have that massive a drop.
So do we have to accept the hold harmless amount? I'm not saying that we shouldn't.
You don't have to. A board is not obligated to levy the complete amount of the revenue limit. You could come in to the board on the meeting on the 26th and say, we're going to under levy by $703,000. That's your way of saying thanks, but no thanks. So yeah, you always have that right as a board to, the revenue limit's a ceiling. There is no floor except for 0. So yes.
Now, next question would be, would we want to do that from a strategy perspective?
Tell me what strategy you're working towards, and I can answer that question.
Fair enough.
I don't see a benefit off the top of my head.
I didn't either. I wasn't advocating for it, but I just wanted to ask the question to make sure we didn't see something sitting. Maybe you guys understood something that we didn't understand that would play into
It would mean tapping into the fund balance that we have to utilize some of the money that we could potentially have kept set aside for future years when we don't have the luxury of this type of a thing.
One reason you could ask that question is, in the formulas, is there a long-term play of under levying the first year? And the answer to that is no.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense.
I'm on a WASBO discussion list, and this actually just came up. People were asking about under levying, and the consensus was, in the long run, it's just going to not be helpful for you, for your district. So it's not a recommended strategy in general.
It can be used to buy goodwill in a community. It can be PR. It can be lots of things. So I've done it on occasion in my career.
Well, and our community benefits from it, so.
The last biggest thing on here, if you go down to the Fund 39 levy, last year we defeased,
2 point something.
we ended up buying down 20% of the principal on the referendum. With that valuation going up 4.6%, this model has a defeasance of $5 million. So that's $5 million of additional principal we could buy down on top of our normally scheduled payments. So we would be looking at, this gets to the art of the levy approval at this point. If we could defease $5 million and still come in at a tax rate of $8.01, which is almost 20-cent drop, we would be a third of the way of paying off the referendum in year 2.
Yeah.
So it gets into that interest savings versus tax impact in today's dollars. But if this pace continues, we'll have the referendum paid off in 6 years. 10's the max. That's what we borrowed for, and that's what we promised. But we're on that path. But I just want to make sure the board and this committee are still in the sooner the better. No interest is guaranteed savings. That's true tax savings. in the pre-referendum guesstimate of cost, we had a 10-year plan, right? We had almost $11 million of interest rate expense estimated. If we do, and we reach that 6-year plan, that $11 million has dropped to $3.8 million in interest costs. So from what we were asked as members of the school community to vote on to what it could end up actually being, you're talking a $7 to $8 million savings. So I built it in here at $5 million. We'll see where the aid comes in. The one guarantee I could tell you, it's not going to be 51,000,005 or 966. It'll be a different number, but we think that's a pretty.
It's close. I think it's a little low, actually.
Just want to make sure that that approach and that mindset is still shared by the committee, because it's a major decision. It's a lot of money.
Comments, questions? Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think we're good at being aggressive in that manner. Even right from the get-go, there's a lot of districts that'll take 20 years to pay this back.
And that's only because they're capped at 20.
Right. They might take more.
Yeah,
and
I think
that increases the interest costs. And to our point, I believe our community is more conservative and does appreciate this kind of savings and moving forward and as quickly as possible to pay down our debt to save those interest monies. And I mean, at least the people that I'm speaking with, that I've talked to, there's been some people who specifically wrote me emails on thanking on that particular topic or calling on that particular topic. It's not a common topic now because we're out of the referendum. We've been spending money and people kind of forgot about it. When we were first talking to our citizens about potentially doing a referendum, that was a big point, though, that people did want to talk a lot about. And so from my perspective, the people that I've spoken with, like that approach. Corey?
I agree. I've heard the same thing. I mean, we're basically buying down debt to save quite a bit of money. Pay more now and save a lot more later. Makes sense to me. I can't think of a reason not to do it except the upfront expenditures,
The only argument that I've heard is, well, if you didn't do that, taxes would be $5 million less today. It's a today versus the cost over the period of the loan. Just like your home mortgage, you pay extra or not. But the calls I took during the referendum process and the 80 whatever meetings I went to over that time, people understand. I think people can relate to this. Unlike all these other things I've talked about or Sherry and I've talked about for the last hour.
Right.
People have mortgages, or they have a car loan, or they have something that they can relate directly to this concept. And I think, for the most part, most people have a similar view. At least that's what I hear. So we'll leave that in there, and we'll fine tune that number. Once we know the aid number, then it's frustrating because we have to wait till the 15th to finalize all these things, right? It's all hypothetical until we get that aid number, but we'll have that in a few days.
Okay. Anything else on this? Thank you. Thank you.
The last page, just to touch on quickly, the revenue limit calculation. I apologize, Joe.
Don't give us a test on it, please.
You want to see the impact that on the left-hand side here where it's pink, you can see the impact of summer school. We usually get 135-ish, 130 ADM out of summer school. It dropped to 48. That's part of that loss in the ADM that you're looking at. That's directly a COVID, because our whole summer school program just kind of imploded in a matter of weeks. But the other thing I'll point out is if you look up the section above where it's in yellow where it has 217, we're going to lose that class next year, that count, where we're at 12,473. And it's going to be replaced with something around the 11,600 mark. And that's where the seriousness of our revenue limit situation, that's where it occurs. It's that flipping over. And within a couple of years, we won't have a year of a count that has 12,000 students anymore. It's going to be 11.5 or it's going to be 11.4. So I just thought I'd draw your attention to those two. I won't waste your time with all the other numbers on the page, but to simplify the situation we're in is right in that section right there.
I think this complicated formula worksheet was the biggest surprise when I got on the board. And I looked at this, and it's just to calculate revenue limit. It's so complex. There's so much that goes into it. So thank you for explaining some components there, some of the more important ones that are going to impact us over time. And every year we have to take it a year at a time, right? And appreciate your hard work on this and guiding us. I mean, obviously it's a worksheet, we have to follow it, but explaining some of the complexities behind it, there's an art to that, so thank you for that. Any questions, specific questions that you want to ask on the revenue worksheet? Okay. All right. We will move on to our next discussion item, and that's the COVID-19 cost report. Finally getting our hands sort of around that a little bit.
We have a work in progress to present tonight. So last month you had asked, can we get an idea of what is COVID going to cost us or costing us? So I started on a cost report. I will tell you it's a work in progress. There's still a lot of moving pieces and things, but I've got it broken down into 4 different segments. The first is tangible items. These are our year-to-date costs so far for things, PPEs and plexiglass, and we'll get into that more on the report. It shows a little bit of a breakdown. But then there's technology, which includes year-to-date costs, but some of those are annual fees. Some of it's how much technology we've purchased, so it's kind of a blend. That one's a real work in progress because I'm still trying to identify of the technology pieces that we purchased, how much of it is extra on top of. We might have already had a technology we were dealing with, but now we've added a layer to deal with the virtual world. And so trying to segregate those out is a little trickier, and our IT department's been very busy, very, very busy these days. So that part is the most work in progress. Staffing, the amount is our total projection for the year. The difference, it isn't year to date, so that's good. Unemployment went back and forth on whether to put this because there is that unknown about what we're getting back, but I thought it'd be good for you to see how much we've actually spent because of COVID so far, but hopefully we'll be getting some back. Like I said, it's a work in progress. Darren already spoke a little bit to this, but there's different places that the funding is going to be coming from, right? We know our ESSER grant. The only thing that's still out there is that $75,000 that's sitting in that lawsuit, although you had said you heard it was dismissed. I haven't seen anything. It wasn't? Okay.
I heard it was.
What was the amount?
About $74,000, $75,000 in there. That's just sitting in that holding spot that may go to the parochial schools or it may come to us depending on, the lawsuit is how is the amount being determined that's going to the parochial schools? The original base was based off of poverty level. And there's a lawsuit now saying it should be based off your total enrollment, not just your poverty level students. And so for now, DPI has released everybody at the poverty level, and the rest is sitting out into a holding fund until the lawsuit is settled. It's about between $74,000 and $75,000.
I think it went away, though. I don't think it's out there.
I have not heard anything to that.
Don't ask me where I heard that, but
I would be good. It's an extra $75,000. But then Darren brought up FEMA. So it turns out that we can file claims with FEMA, and we are. As Darren said, it's a little over $500,000 at this point. But with FEMA, it's a real unknown. What are they going to give us out of that money? Is it a straight reimbursement? Here you go. Is it, the higher, if your claim is over a certain threshold, it takes longer because they really have to go in and scrutinize what you're doing, what you're claiming. So they don't even give you a timeline of how long it's going to take to know this information. So we're going to try, see what we can get. It can be ongoing. We can continue to file certain things with them, but as of September 30th, they dropped off some of our, they dropped off like PPEs and those sort of things, which is one of our bigger expenditures. So, PPEs are no longer going to be allowable on FEMA. But we're going to claim what we had up till September 30th and see what they say. So on the back of your summary is just kind of the base start of this report. Tangible items. We have cleaning and supplies and equipment that we've already purchased just strictly for COVID, coming in at over $250,000. Some miscellaneous items for $6,700, plexiglass. And we're still buying plexiglass as it becomes available because there became a large plexiglass shortage in our country to get. So we spent over $100,000 on buying the plexiglass that includes the supplies to make the divider. So we've been making a lot in-house. That includes everything it costs to make them, not personnel time. PPEs, $150,000 on PPEs so far. Thermometers, over $5,000 in thermometers. Food service equipment, an additional $58,000 in food service equipment, things to help deliver meals to classrooms, or now that we're going back to 4 days a week with the face-to-face for the high school students, we have to really spread out the serving areas, so we have to buy some more equipment to be able to move hot food out into different areas and serve from there. So those are the kind of things when we say we don't know what we're going to need. As things evolve and change, there's always something new to think about. So those are the kind of things, one of the things we would see coming back for, saying, boy, we needed a lot more in the cleaning supplies, or something was now a shortage and the price went up, or we had to go to a different distributor. There's a lot of what ifs in that tangible category. Technology year to date, that's a really low number at this point just because we're still trying to identify things, but a couple of the things we've identified are WebEx for rooms, a Blackboard shell build out, and a virtual ESL curriculum. So I'm expecting this to be quite a bit higher as we can work through more details of the technology. Staffing. These are the things that have been identified for that we need because of COVID-19. Mainly EHC staff, a big chunk of money because of and we've got a section, the next section is talking about pupils and where we're at. Open enrollment, a lot of open enrollment into EHC, so they've had to hire a lot more EHC staff to account for that. So that figure comes in at close to $2 million. Additional nursing staff to help with all of the COVID-related things, $80,000. Contact tracers at $30,000. They're part-time. That number seemed low to me, but
It's also very
yes, it's an hourly rate kind of thing that people put in as needed, and it could get higher, it could get lower.
But we're making the assumption right now, we're bringing the secondary back 4 days a week. That's more time, so we're kind of extrapolating out a guesstimate on the tracing staffing to kind of. That's not scientific, but it's the best we have at this point.
And they needed some additional part-time 4K teachers, which is interesting when we look at our student counts. I think I might dig into more of why we needed that, but I think it had to do more with dealing with the virtual world of 4K, that they're the virtual teachers that were needed in addition to the current staff. And then unemployment. We have spent over $900,000 in unemployment so far, and it's definitely dropped off because we've got everybody back in working now. Those that chose not to come back would not continue to get unemployment. The only place we're still impacted by unemployment, and it's minimal, is that, let's say we had someone who is doing something like coaching for us where they normally wouldn't get unemployment. Well, if they lost their job due to a COVID-related item, we would have to pick up some unemployment based on the rules. And if those people continue to be off, we would continue to see, but that was a very, very, very small amount of this, so.
Is that because it's considered their primary income then? Because
No,
it's,
it's 18 months of the look-back
'Cause
period.
it's not a
So any
primary income
employer
level,
within that
right?
18 months could fall into being, because we all helped employ that person over that look-back period. So you get your billing, but it's prorated. We don't get hit.
No, it's prorated. That's what I'm saying. It's a really tiny amount, but we'll still see some trickling in based off of other unemployment, even though we brought our people back. But it's small. It'll be very small.
The other thing, and I think this is true, the unemployment cross fiscal years. So a lot of those costs were booked in last fiscal year.
This
So,
is our total from March
yeah,
on.
this is a COVID cost, not a fiscal
Yeah.
year statement.
Gotcha.
Thank you, that's what everything else pretty much is hit in this fiscal year. Unemployment crossed the fiscal year, so this does include last fiscal year and this fiscal year. It isn't just this fiscal year.
And I think the cost that we'll never know, but I can tell you it's probably greater than what's on this list, is the opportunity cost of all of the man hours that went into COVID that we'll never be able to file a claim for. But it, as you know, it's just probably consumed more than your regular job some weeks. It's consumed everything we're doing. I mean, every conversation's tied to COVID. So I could bring in the whole budget basically and say, here's the cost of COVID this year, so.
Gave a good example. You know, we're putting the plexiglass together, our people.
Some of it, yeah.
So, you know, they're getting paid for overtime, but we're not capturing that in this
Oh, yeah, it's,
to get reimbursed for. So, and people working many extra hours.
Yeah.
Teachers, staff, everybody. I mean, there's just tons and tons. And thank you, everybody, for working so hard to get us. I thought we had a great September. You know, as good as we could. We pulled together a lot of just tough aspects. And, you know, just example after example I heard of people going the extra mile at all various levels of staffing. So thank you, everyone, for your hard extra work, including people in this room. I know you guys have put in a lot of extra time. It's virtually every department, every group of employees, everybody has been going the extra mile.
it's interesting. I was driving home on the bypass and I was out by Salesville Road and I saw two buses leave at night, which I'm sure were a West Athletic something or other. And I thought to myself, I bet you pre-COVID that was a one-bus trip. But because of spacing and everything, you know, there's just you can get down to the pennies essentially, but the costs are everywhere. I mean, it's being felt in every area of our operation.
Thank you for that perspective, Darren. Appreciate that.
So again, this is going to be an evolving document as we continue to identify costs, and every month we can bring it back maybe as part of the budget update. I can add it to that and just have you see where we're at.
Okay. Anything else on this? Any other questions or comments? All right. A report on pupil selection. When this was agendized, I'm like, what is this?
Well, Sherry and I think, both agreed, there's a story to be told in all this data, but I'm not sure what it is. We tried to map where were kids last year and where are kids today. Virtual, e-achieve, homeschooling. So this is our attempt to kind of sort it for you. And I'm going to let Sherry do that for you because I don't know if there's some neat things in there, but I don't know if it tells the whole story or not. So
Exactly. I think that's a good way to put it. There's some interesting things, but a lot of the content is me drawing conclusions from it, not necessarily fact. So it's just, here's something that's interesting. Let's take a look at it and talk about it. But yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it's a COVID impact, essentially, report.
That's what we're trying to get at.
From a different angle.
Yeah.
And actually owe Mr. O'Brien a report. He had asked about what's bus ridership like. This one took so much time, I have to get that one out, but I don't know if there's a story there either. It's less, it's different, but I don't know if it's telling us anything.
Well, it's going to change too, because right now when we were with the 2-day face-to-face for secondary, they had one level of busing they needed, but now you're taking everybody back. How is that going to impact? So the story's not over at all on the busing side of things. It's going to be evolving all year long. So I think before I go into kind of my summary, I'm going to have you take a look at this particular, the first chart on there. And what this tells us is basically broken down by school. Where was the enrollment for that school in 2019-20? Where is it today? And then after today, it's broken down into 3 columns of that enrollment. Where are those students? For elementary, are they face-to-face? Are they virtual, or are they e-achieve? Virtual being the the school district new elementary virtual. And then the difference from last year to this year. And I think the really interesting thing when I looked at this first is like, wow, look at the elementary totals. That's a significant drop of students in elementary level. Some of my conclusions are, if I was a parent, I think it'd be easier to homeschool a elementary student versus a secondary student. So some parents may be withholding students for homeschooling. Some parents may be sending kids to parochial schools because the class sizes are a little bit smaller. There's just a lot of what ifs. I have a little more breakdown on some of the open enrollment numbers that talk about that a little bit more. But one of the big things I found in my evaluation is a big drop in the 4Kers. And there's one where that's not a necessary grade level, right? So it's very easy to not enroll your child in 4K. But we had a lot of 4Kers open enroll out, which I found really interesting too. But that
A lot's how many though? Just
Oh, I'm
just
sorry.
help frame that
I'm sorry.
number.
Yes, that's true. Compared to last year and this year, last year we had 23 4Kers open and roll out, and this year we had 44. So it did almost double, but you're right, when you're talking numbers compared to our overall enrollment number. But 4K overall, that was one part of the 4K drop, and we'll go into that in a little bit in some of the other detail. One thing I do have to apologize for on this particular chart, when you're looking at I've counted the eAchieve kids twice because I didn't realize that the eAchieve number also included our kids now going to eAchieve, not just the open enrollment kids. So the 1333 actually includes the kids up in this column, the 100 at the secondary level, the 272 middle schoolers that are going, and the 186. So when you look at the overall enrollment numbers, there are quite a few that have been double counted in that 12,900 total. It's actually 12,289 is the overall enrollment, which reflects more with what we're seeing on the ADM side of things. So I do apologize for that. That was my error in interpreting some data. But overall, you can see the numbers. The interesting thing to me is that the high schools and the middle schools were much less impacted than the elementary schools. In fact, high school, we've actually grown some, had some additional students. So in looking at how to look at this and break this down, I looked at what are some things that influence it? And open enrollment was a big one. The very last chart is our history of an open enrollment, strictly from the percentage of dollars. What are we expecting in our ins versus our outs? And you can see that very right-hand column, the spike in the dollar amount. Two things, the open enrollment transfer rate went up, so you would expect that even to increase a bit if you had the same level of students. But our overall open enrollment number of students has increased dramatically, and a lot of that is eAchieve. And I'm assuming that there's districts where they either just don't have as strong of a virtual presence as we do, that parents have found eAchieve to be a good option for their students. So in looking at that, I wanted to look at, our new open enrollments. Every year we can identify, you would assume that the students that have been open enrolling are going to continue about the same. So I wanted to compare the new open enrollments, and that's, it was interesting to me because the overall difference of new open enrollments was really only 15 more students. But what I found that was interesting in looking at some of the data, it seemed that some of the kids that open enrolled out of our district in the past are coming back because that open enrollment out number has decreased on the kids that were existing open enrollment outs. So that's why the net doesn't look as big as you would expect with all of the huge, this is the open enroll outs, I'm sorry, to be specific about what open enrollment I'm talking about. I expected it to be a little bit bigger, but like I said, the net difference, but you can kind of see with the breakdown here, again, the biggest number is our 4Kers at 21. Otherwise, the differences are fairly insignificant from one year to the next, but there's a large 4K presence that have opened and rolled out. I put down below the big difference, where they were last year versus where they are this year, and it just seems to be some of the local districts, Oconomowoc, Palmyra, we haven't had open enrollment out to, and Palmyra shocked me a little bit, to be honest.
Right.
And Pewaukee, so I don't know if parents have different jobs that take them out now to different areas, and it's just more convenient for them to take their children to a school closer to where they work, but it was more just interesting information on that one.
The hard part about all this is a snapshot in open enrollment. This changes. Second semester, if every district flips back to whatever this open enrollment parent wants, that kid could leave us. So there's no check coming for, what's the net here, $5 million?
Till the end of the year.
Till the end of the year. And that number will be, we could give you a different graph every day, but the trend is good. You can see why it matches up with the staffing conversation with the Achieve, and
We do get paid for the services we deliver,
prorated,
Right.
yes. Yep.
Correct.
so.
Correct, and yes, so yes, if someone leaves it goes back to their original district, we still get paid for the part that we did
Right.
educate them.
It's not
But
either,
it's always changing all year long. I mean, I always have one budget figure at the beginning of the year for our net difference between open enrollment in and out. And ultimately, throughout the year, we just kind of watch it to see where it's going. And this year, the numbers are coming in a lot higher than what I have budgeted, but I am reluctant to change my budget because you just don't know with COVID what's going to happen. So I'm not going to change it right now.
So as I mentioned earlier, I don't think our resident enrollment's this bad, but I don't think our enrollment's this good.
right.
I think there's a COVID factor in there that could shift, or has shifted these numbers slightly.
Like here.
And my son, who's a sophomore, 3 of his best friends just left. And I just had to look at this and I was like, okay, the third Friday of September, pupil count. So even though they left after the third Friday, because they just left in the last week and a half, we still got credit for them?
We got to
or
count them, yep.
If they were there.
For the whole year?
If they
or
were in
just right
attendance.
now?
If they were in attendance.
Yep.
Prior to that.
We don't get to count them in January, which helps us in aid and other things, but the main funding day is the third Friday in September. That's the most crucial fiscal day we have.
So then those districts where they went don't get that?
They don't get to count them because they're not a resident. Now, if they will get credit for the partial year of open enrollment, that those students will be there. But that's, $7,000 or something like that, rather than the $10,000 we get for counting them.
The open enrollment transfer rate is less than the revenue per member. And so if they open enroll out, they are paid out of our open enrollment ins a percentage of the time that they were actually.
And prorated.
That's what I mean,
Yep.
it's prorated,
Yeah.
correct. They don't get paid that full amount for the year if
They
they
did
spend
us a
some time
favor.
with us.
Whether they did it on purpose or not, I don't know, but we'll
I don't
take
know
it.
about that with the declining enrollment potential. I don't know if
You get
that's a
lucky once in a while.
favor.
Yeah.
It works against us too at other times, so.
Right. For this year, it's not a bad thing. So, yeah, as we started this conversation, it's interesting and there's a lot of data to look at, but there's not one thing that I can come back with and say, ta-da, here's this information.
There's a lot of stuff happening. That's about all we can tell you.
Yeah.
But there's some obvious things. Open enrollment's way up, e-achieve staffing's up. I mean, there's things that are moving together, but can we read into the minds of the parents in our school district right now based off of this report? There's just no real clear fact being identified, I don't think, but we gave it a try.
Yeah, are parents out there still working from home so they're homeschooling, but then they get called back to work, suddenly things get better in the COVID world, then are those kids coming back suddenly? We just don't know. I mean,
Your standard COVID topic where there is no real answers.
Yeah, Corey.
Yeah, I was actually talking with my wife before this meeting. She said, what's the normal loss and what's the normal trend? And can you quantify what's due to COVID? And I think we don't know, right?
Like anything, we could sit here and each of us come up with probably a range of what we think it is, but to just say, and that's kind of where I was when we started talking about this report, is I thought there's kind of spun off of the COVID cost report we did.
Sure.
But once we got into it, it just didn't pop. Like there was no clear, it wasn't like 80% of our kids all went to eAchieve all of a sudden or something of that ilk at all. But
Yeah, I mean, overall, the actual butts and seats number of kids, we're down 429 students, but again, that gets averaged in. You would normally expect, we were expecting at least 100 of that. Well, when you take that 100 out, that's pretty close to where we are on this chart on this table of 313 elementary kiddos out, and then, but the key is, where did they go? We know some of it's open and rolled out, but not anymore, not that much more than we normally expect. Our open enrollment in has increased significantly compared to our open enrollment out has gone up a little bit, not much. So then you're looking at homeschooling and those types of things, parochial school. Those are the things that you're looking at as to where those kids went and how much of that is COVID related. I would venture to guess quite a bit, but we can't say that for sure without picking up the phone and calling these parents and saying, hey, why are you doing this?
so hopefully that was helpful.
Or confusing, I don't know which one.
Any other questions or comments on that? All right. Moving on to our employee health clinic.
This is a quick hitter, just to give you more of an update on what's coming in the months ahead rather than a full report. Since spring, we've been looking at the best delivery model for the clinic and just seeing if what we're doing now is the best fit and cost-wise and all those other factors. And we've shared the results of our RFI. So I just wanted to map out the timeline because there is some things we need to make decisions on by the end of the calendar year. But since our last report, I've shared the results that I shared with you with our partners. They had some questions that went back to ProHealth, and then I shared with them ProHealth's responses to them, and all that's in the packet. I won't bother reading it to you. Nothing too glaring. Obviously, there's some things we can't answer at this point because we haven't defined a specific plan, and we're under contract with the employee clinic through 2021. Having a hard time believing it's 2021, but so giving them a chance for feedback. I've also offered to set up a call with them and ProHealth if they want to dig into it on a more detailed basis. So what I'm envisioning is on November 9th at our next meeting, ProHealth and HNI, who's our consultant, come in and do a presentation for FNF. Your chance to ask questions, maybe talk to staff about things they would like to see or hear, or just gather up questions. If you want to get those questions to me prior to the meeting, it might help ProHealth kind of be prepared to answer those, but that's not a requirement. And then at the 11th meeting, just kind of update the board on what's coming. I don't know how aware that they are. I mean, we report out this is being talked about, but with everything else going on, this might not have been the thing that stuck in their minds. And then come back on the 7th. I need some sort of action because if we're going to stay with our current arrangement with the clinic, they're getting ready to do a RFI to bid out the clinic services. So they want to know whether we're part of it, and I feel an obligation as a partner to say whether we're in or out of the RFI process in December, if you're comfortable doing that. And then we'd wrap that up at the board meeting or 2 nights later, and then I would provide them notice at December. But ultimately, we're under no obligation. It's strictly a moral obligation, I guess, and what we feel we need to, the timeline we feel we need to provide them notice one way or the other. So I just wanted to map all those things out. I've included the PowerPoint that was shared with the committee previously. The Q&A back and forth is the green sheets. So in the boxes are CBIZ and the partners' questions, and then ProHealth's responses is below it, and it just walks you through. And then I have the fiscal RFI responses here. So that was the most critical information for you to have. there any
Questions or comments?
questions on that?
I think the timeline is good. I think it's appropriate. I think we need to communicate openly with our partners and figure, they need to understand where we stand with these things. So I appreciate you taking that on and getting this information to them and working with them. And obviously, we have some decisions made, but we won't make those decisions till we have greater understanding through the presentation next month. So, excellent. So presentation, or November?
November we will, next
Yeah,
month.
Yeah, next month. Decision in December.
Yep.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you. So that concludes our action items. As always, we ask if there are any topics you'd like to see agendized on F&F for future meetings. Yes, Corey?
I don't know if it's the right committee. Mrs. Voigt brought it up. Talking about aids and funding and raises, is that HR committee?
Well, it could be, from a funding perspective, it might be more appropriate here, but there are aspects, obviously, to HR that could spread into the HR committee. So were you looking more specifically on funding, or?
I guess to begin the discussion, I'm sure it's been discussed already, but what does the board want to do, if anything, about dealing with the shortages we have in some aids and some other assistance?
Yeah,
Try to
so,
deal with that.
so from that perspective, maybe it would make sense to start in HR.
Okay.
But we can get that information to Kurt. Would you agree with that, Darren? I mean.
It's always a gray area on these things. It's
You
kind of a-
So if there's a financial implication, it'll eventually get to us, right?
I would recommend to go through HR would be my recommendation. It starts there,
Okay. Because the information I'd be looking for is what would be the cost of, increasing those part-time employees to full-time, health insurance and all that, just to
Sure.
quantify that, because there's a discussion obviously going around about that,
Sure.
so just to quantify that, but is HR going to, I would assume, I guess I don't want to assume, are they going to look into that and then make their recommendations to the board? I don't want to duplicate the work.
We can have Darren reach out to Kurt. Why don't you have a discussion with Kurt as a chairperson? And, or maybe give it to Sharon and have Sharon have the discussion either way, however you'd like to do that. Because I think there are both committees that could potentially have this discussion,
Make
so.
the argument either way.
Yeah, I mean, we actually in the past have done calculations on what it would cost to have our part-time people be full-time, and, with respect to that comes along with benefits. That's the big cost factors, the benefits side of things. So, I mean, we've addressed some of these things in the past, but it's been a number of years since we have, and we're in different times.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
why don't we reach out to HR?
Yep.
And have it start there, and then we'll see where that discussion goes. And financial numbers can be presented at HR too. It's
Right.
not like we're only going to talk about this aspect, but it eventually comes around back to, the budgeting process and what can we afford and so on and so forth. That could potentially be an amendment. Budget amendment. I'm not saying that we should have it, but
Anything's possible, like I said.
that's the advantage of taking the approach that we are.
And if we find out that HR chooses not to deal with that issue, we can still
Oh, sure.
bring it up through here and then.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, it might have a little different lens
Sure.
through this committee, but
Okay, thank you.
yeah, Diane.
And very similar, closely related to that would be the idea of raising the payment for substitutes as well, to be competitive.
Yeah, and that always has been handled in HR. What that should be. I mean, but then that has that impact of rolling into the budget. So, but those discussions in the past have been HR oriented.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think it's HR too is I think Sharon's the one who's going to be able to better provide you sub rates or fill rates. When I say sub rates, openings, and that's her area. So
Yeah, because I
can touch on both those.
As a COVID-related matter, though, it's with now all the teachers that are put into, temporary kinds of, situations where they can't be in the classroom. It's a very different need now for subs than what we would have without the COVID situation because of quarantine.
Okay. No, I'll talk to Karen and Kurt tomorrow. Or Sharon and Kurt.
Any other topics? Yeah,
Am I
sure.
allowed to present a topic or no?
Oh, sure.
Darren's looking at me like, oh.
I thought we only
Give
removed
yourself a
topics
raise.
from the list.
But no, we're in the year 5 of our food service contract with Aramark. And we have to go to RFP, which is a pretty big process, and we're just starting it. We are hoping we would get an exemption and be able to, because of COVID, to go another year, because anyone who was involved in the last one, it's a lot of people coming here, we're supposed to be going to other places, and just a lot of things you don't necessarily want to be doing during COVID. But the federal government is not changing that rule, and if we're participating in the National School Lunch Program, we have to go to bid. So I know the last time there were lots of different people involved when it came to selection criteria, so just putting that thought out there on, I thought there might have been parent involvement at some point. I seem to recall there was at least a committee to talk about with parents, are you happy with what you see? But it might have been part of Todd. I think Todd had a standing thing with parents.
I think Todd had a committee already, a health wellness
Yeah.
committee or something.
And I don't know if that's still available.
Or did he bounce that off of the PTA or the school representatives with
Might have
his
been that, too.
superintendent's
Yeah, so just
Advisory
things.
committee?
advisory committee? Yes, thank you, Karen.
But I know we had board members on the committee too to select, I believe. And so just food for thought to be thinking about that.
Food for thought, really.
I know I'm so funny. Anyways, so just, I don't know what you want, if there's anything what you want from us in the process. We're just right now going through, there's a template we have to follow with the DPI. We have to get them to approve our RFP. And then we start, there'll be timelines starting probably January, February of all the different meetings that need to be involved or that need to be part of the process. So just putting that out there that it's.
How about if you come back maybe in a month or two, just reminding us of what the RFP process is and kind
Absolutely.
of,
Timeline and-
yeah.
Yep, we'll have a
and-
timeline. We could do
yeah,
that
and
next month with the
start off the
timeline.
discussion and see if we want to stick to what we've done in the past or if we think that there's something unique that's come along now that we want to change that process up. And, I think that's,
The big challenge right now is what data do you use, right? Because we went from the National School Lunch Program that ended on March 16th or whatever day that was we left to the summer food program. So now our summer food program numbers are just totally inflated. So we have to go
Right.
back a year and actually supply them with data from 18-19 seems. We're comparing that to the average sales, daily sales for when we were in session last year, but pretty much we're providing 18-19. But
are you guys okay with that? Maybe in a couple months or whatever?
Yes.
Learn about the process of the past and see if that makes sense forward in the future. Yeah, Diane.
And I have another, if
Yes.
we're done with that topic. You'd mentioned bus ridership is a topic that was something that Kurt was asking about. I've had a question, did we go with the money that we talked about for treatment of the buses?
Oh, yeah, we're buying that.
That's
was
part
in
of
the
the COVID
list in the
expenses?
COVID, yeah.
Okay, so that does include the bus.
Yeah, we're
bus
buying
treatment.
it, I'm buying it in, I think it's 50-day segments in case we were shut down or so. I didn't want to have a warehouse full of, I can't remember what the stuff, Zoom, Z something. So we're buying it in segments, so we've already paid, I think, for half of the school year. So it's not the total cost, isn't it?
Yeah, we had to buy $100,000, right?
Yeah, it was
worth
like
up front.
110 maybe or
Yeah.
something like that.
That's the spray that lasts 30 days. that
Yep.
they-
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
right.
zinc.
So no,
Yeah.
we are doing that.
Okay. Any other topics for consideration? Okay, thank you for those ideas. I'm trying to do this whole meeting electronically. I know I got papers around me, but. All right, so we do have a need for executive session. So I would be looking for a motion. Yeah,
I
Corey?
can do it. I'll move to adjourn to executive session pursuant to WISTATS 19.85 sub 1E for deliberating or negotiating the purchasing of public properties, the investing of public funds, or conducting other specified public business, whenever competitive or bargaining reasons required a closed session. First student bus contract in Oakdale offer to purchase, tax keys WAKC 1360198, WAKC 137700202, and WAKC 1377003.
Is there a second to that motion? Second by Diane. This is a roll call vote. Darren, you want to take that?
Ms. Foyt,
Aye.
Ms. Reinacek,
Aye.
Frontillo,
Aye.
and Mr. Como.
Aye, passes 4-0. So we will go into closed session immediately. We may need to reconvene to open session. We don't know that yet, but typically we don't.
We don't retelecast
Yeah.
it normally.
Decide.
We don't know how long.
Yeah. So it'll still be an open portion of the meeting if we need it, but it will not be televised. So thank you, everyone.
I know
Have a
we're
good
running
evening.
long tonight. Do you want to take